5B will probably end up being moved until later because Noreen is not going to be here until a little bit later, and that's her presentation. So just a heads up that we may be swapping things around in section 5. So to begin, we'll do introductions and establish a quorum. So we can start at this end and do intros from that end over. Oh, sure. Oh, okay. Was there?
You had something?
Oh, good morning, everyone. My name is Mike. I'll be your webcaster today. I just wanted to remind everyone to speak into the microphone about the proper distance, speak into the microphone about the hang loose time. So the way that you're not screaming into the ear of the webcast or if they can't hear you. If you have any questions as far as the webcast or the room today, I can assist you.
Thank you.
Natalie Lyons.
Dr. Robert Snowden.
Joseph Holt, Institutional Representative.
Thomas Wong, happy to be here on my first meeting.
Welcome.
Margaret Ryder.
Kate Lee Carey, Institutional Representative.
Sarah Mason with the Senate Committee on Business Professions and Economic Development.
David Weiss, institutional member.
Diana Maya, public member.
All right.
Do you want to introduce Doug?
Doug, would you like to introduce yourself?
Doug Smith from Legal Affairs.
This Doug is our.
This is my first meeting.
Yes.
Like 2 newbies in one meeting. All right.
Thrilled.
Michael Marion, Bureau Chief for Private Posts.
Richie, do we have a quorum? All right. Quorum established. So moving on, the first agenda item under number 2 is public comments on items not on the agenda. If anyone has anything that they want to, and Mr. Johnson approaches the bench. Now's your chance for public comments on non-agenda items. Welcome, Robert.
Thanks for the TA, Mike. Appreciate that. I never get that microphone length right. Good morning. My name is Robert Johnson. I'm the director for the California Association of Private Postsecondary Schools. Every 4 or 5 years, this issue seems to crop up at the Bureau. And it's interesting that we always manage to find an accommodation, but it, I think, clearly seems to generate under the definition of private post-secondary education. And just as for the new folk, you can find that under section 94857, where it basically talks about the reason for post-secondary education is for academic, vocational, or continuing education. So that seems to set the parameters about what the Bureau's purpose is and basically what it regulates. Flash forward to the present, there are a number of schools that do things what I call kind of the fun category. And these schools are typically culinary schools, they're jewelry schools, they're IT schools that do gaming, and they offer to the general public 2-hour or 3-hour courses. The classic one was the fondue class. That was the last time we had this discussion at the advisory committee a number of years ago, where if you wanted to learn how to do fondue, you could go to a 2-hour class at a culinary school, I think pay a nominal fee of $15 or $20, and then basically learn how to do fondue to dazzle your guests. That reiteration kind of occurs in various numbers of schools, but basically they're just essentially fun things offered for the public, cover the cost, let the school be part of the community. It basically allows people to kind of get some education quote in things that really they like. Strictly avocational, not anything that counts toward any kind of degree or certificate or anything like that. So what's happening is that within the Bureau, there have been conflicting decisions around these kinds of courses. And the Bureau basically is now, in some instances, telling these schools that they have to enroll the student, they have to fill out a enrollment form, they have to provide a high school diploma for a course if they don't have a high school diploma. Again, for a 2-hour course in cooking The one I liked was tequilas and tacos. I thought that was pretty interesting. But it essentially equates that kind of activity to a activity of enrolling in a school as a regular student. And it's obviously not the intent of the act to deal with these, but I do think there are some interpretations that could lend itself to saying anything a school does has to be regulated. But the reality of life is that just applying the refund policy to a 2-hour class would be essentially impossible. So it just kind of the law itself doesn't really lend itself to these kinds of issues. The accreditors have dealt with this basically in a number of ways. A number of accreditors have just said, yeah, we don't care. It's not a deal. Other accreditors said, well, if you're going to offer a 2-hour course in making jewelry, just list it on your thing, and that's good. We're good with that. So it's been treated differently by different accreditors. Traditionally, the Bureau basically just ignored this because after discussions with various players, it was clearly not considered to be efficient or useful use of the Bureau's time to try to regulate jewelry making or cooking classes. The more serious things were essentially in operation. So I was fine with that. That seemed to be the way that it worked. And life went on. As staff turns over and basically people become aware of various interpretations, these issues tend to resurface. So what we're seeing at this point is that there's a resurfacing of kind of a compliance fine situation for schools that are offering essentially fun courses that are not academic, not occupational, nothing in the realm of what the Bureau is basically there to do. So hoping just from a way to preempt more resources being expended on something I've always considered to be incredibly frivolous, that we just basically kind of come to, again, a reasoned understanding what to do with these courses. So just laying that out a little bit, clearly would like to, if there's a further dialogue that needs to occur, be happy to participate in that. But it's just one of those little anomalies that hopefully gets addressed in the reauthorization. I mean, one of the reasons I chose to speak on this morning is that I know that the department and the Bureau are basically starting to consider some issues around the reauthorization, and clearly a more definitive discussion, even if it's just a paragraph, about what is not the responsibility for the Bureau to come in and do an inspection and taste the tequila and the taco to make sure it's correct. It's probably not a good for an on-site visit, probably not appropriate. So thank you.
Thanks, Robert. And just so for the newbies who may not be understanding what Robert's talking about, there are exemptions in the law for
I'm
institutions.
sorry, we can't discuss these items because they're not on the agenda.
I was just going to explain what the context is. Is that not okay?
Unless you're going to plan to place it on a future agenda, if the topic is not on the agenda, we recommend that you don't discuss it.
Okay.
So just for the newer members, I'm outgoing counsel for the Bureau for Private Postsecondary Education. Mr. Smith will be taking over for you at future meetings. But the Open Meeting Act prohibits the bodies, any state body, from discussing an item that's not previously noticed on the agenda for discussion. And items that are not on the agenda, the public's allowed to discuss, but the committee themselves cannot discuss unless they're determining whether to place it on a future agenda. That's the only exception to the Open Meeting Act.
Can we clarify something to see if we need to put it on a future agenda?
We're supposed to simply discuss whether you would like to place it on a future agenda. If you don't understand what the issue is, you could ask the speaker to explain what specifically they would suggest placing on a future agenda, because the speakers would be able to tell. He can say anything he likes, but it's the committee that can't discuss it.
This just got a lot longer.
Yes, let me add to my presentation that might be helpful to the committee. is that there are exemptions within the Act that basically tell the Bureau those are things that you do not have to be concerned with. Those are found in Division 7.5. And under K, I'll read that. It says, education offered for purposes of personal entertainment, pleasure, or employment means education offered for the purposes of play, amusement, or relaxation, including education offered for the purpose of teaching the fundamentals, skills, or techniques of a hobby or activity. So that laid out kind of the fun part of what a school could do. Not to take it too far down the road for David because he's tired and had a tough night last night, I will just say that part of the problem is institution exemptions are institutions, program exemptions are not discussed. So clearly there was a mistake in not putting this as a program exemption because the staff is struggling with the concept of institutional exemptions. So obviously nobody wants their institution exempted for doing a fondue making party. That is absurd. But it's also absurd to essentially interpret those fondue parties as kind of a curriculum that needs to be treated the same way as something in IT or allied health. So it goes both ways, and frankly, it looks silly to kind of get involved in this kind of discussion. But it's happening, and there are fines being levied, so I think it's important that we kind of nip this in the bud if we can. Madam Chair, is there anything else you'd like me to?
No, that was very helpful. Thank you, Robert.
You're welcome.
Is it okay if I ask the speaker questions? I can do that or not?
No, I mean, unless you're just trying to figure out what the issue is for a future agenda. So if you're not clear on what you'd like to potentially discuss at a future meeting, you can certainly ask him to explain that.
Thank you for raising the issue, Mr. Johnson. Any other public comments on non-agenda items? Seeing none, we will move on to item 3, review and approval of the advisory committee meeting minutes. I know that there was at least one error, Beth Scoot, who will be called Scoot from now on, which should have been Beth Scott, which I think, Christy, you said was on page 11.
Correct. On page 11, it refers to Ms. Scott as Beth Scoot, so I would recommend changing that to her correct name. And then on page 20, agenda item number 9, the last sentence, it says Ms. Shields suggested having a DCA representing. It should say representative. So just those two changes, I would ask the committee to amend the minutes to accept that revision. So if you're okay with the rest of the minutes, it could be a motion to approve the minutes with the 2 revisions.
Did anyone else have any notes, revisions? No? Okay. Would someone like to make a motion to approve as
I make a motion to
revised?
approve the minutes.
Thank you, David. Second?
With the 2 revisions?
Oh, yes, absolutely.
Thank you.
Otherwise, Beth will officially be Beth Scoot for the rest of her life. Can I have a second?
Second.
Thank you, Margaret. All those in favor? Start at that end. Kevin, I'm not sure you're a voter, are you? Thank you. And thank you for being here, Kevin. We're glad you're here.
Aye.
Thank you.
Aye.
Aye.
I will abstain since I wasn't here.
Aye.
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 I'm going to abstain too.
All right. Richie, did you get all that? Okay. Oh, yeah, absolutely. So Thomas, new member. Michael just suggested that maybe you give us a little background on yourself as you're joining us.
Sure. Thank you for the time, Madam Chair. I'm delighted to be here to join the BPP Advisory Committee. I'm the Speaker's public appointee. Glad to be here replacing, I think my predecessor was Tamika Butler.
Okay.
But I currently work for Southern California Edison in public affairs. I was previously on staff as a special assistant for Controller Betty Yee. I worked for Mike King when he was in the State Assembly and have worked in the public policy and public affairs space for about 10 years now. I'm also elected to a local water board in my neighborhood in Southern California in San Diego Valley, just outside of the city of LA. But pleased to be here and to kind of be able to have this opportunity to work with you and to learn and to kind of grow into this opportunity.
Well, thank you. Great to have you. You have big shoes to fill because Tamika was pretty awesome. All right. So moving on to number 4, which is remarks by the representatives of the Department of Consumer Affairs. Michael, I'll let you take this one.
Yes, so I have a letter that was submitted this morning from the new DCA director. It should be in everybody's packet. I will just read the first paragraph, and it should be copies on the back table for everybody. So the Department of Consumer Affairs, we are pleased to share with you on October 8th, 2019, Governor Gavin Newsom announced his new appointment, Kimberly Kirchmeyer, as the Director, Department of Consumer Affairs. Ms. Kirchmeyer enters her new role with a wealth of DCA experience. Ms. Kirchmeyer has served as Executive Director of the Medical Board of California since 2013, where she was a Deputy Director from 2011 to 2013. She was a Deputy Director of the Board of Bureau Relations at the Department of Consumer Affairs from 2009 to 2011, and the Deputy Director of Medical Board of California from 2005 to 2009, where she is a Staff Service Manager from also 2001 to 2005, and an Associate of Governmental Program Analysis from 1999 to 2001. Ms. Kirchmeyer also is a member of the International Association of Medical Regulators Authorities Federation of the State of Medical Board Committee, Administration in Medicine, and the United States Medical Licensing Examining Board Advisory Panel. Ms. Kirchmeyer looks forward to the leadership and working with everybody and carrying out her vision for the department. I had the opportunity to meet with Ms. Kirchmeyer actually the week before she was appointed, which was a huge surprise to me when I found out that next week. We've had a great conversation, and she's definitely on board in supporting the Bureau in its future, and we look forward to working with her. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Michael. Moving on to agenda item 5, Bureau Operations Update and Discussion. First up, Compliance and Discipline. Beth Scoot? Yeah. I'm sorry, I'm just never going to stop calling you that now. The two Beths are with us. Disciplinary highlights, citations and fines, school inspections by the Bureau.
Yes. Good morning. My name is Beth Scott. I'm the enforcement chief. I know.
You almost said Scoot, didn't you?
Almost. That's what I need, another nickname. I'm going to be speaking to you today regarding discipline, cite and fine, and compliance inspections. So first I'm going to speak about the statistics for discipline starting on page 25. So that's 25 and 26. The first item is our statement of issues, which is what is filed for the denial of a renewal or an application. So we have 22 cases pending with the Attorney General. The Bureau has a very proactive approach to ensuring only schools that meet the minimum operating standards are licensed, so that high number of statement of issues with the Attorney General is indicative of all that work, of the hard work of the licensing unit. So I wanted to talk about that, and there's a breakdown of the actions taken on those. Our statement of issues, as well as our accusations, are moving rather swiftly through the Attorney General's office. We have 17 accusations pending at the Attorney General's office. The majority of those are already served, so they're either going to end up with a settlement or a hearing. And the hearing dates will be set, and then we'll get the proposed decision after the hearing. So we have 17 current accusations at the Attorney General.
What are the types of accusations?
The types of accusations, you mean there's any of the minimum operating standards. It could be refund issues, fraud, anything that a school does that's outside of the laws and regs.
Okay.
Does that?
Anything is, there's,
well,
this is serious stuff, right? This is,
yes, right. Very serious. Anything that reaches a level of student harm. So it could be, fraud with Title IV funds. It could be any. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay. Does that answer your question? Okay. So I'm going to move on to cite and fine if there's no other questions regarding statement of issues and accusations.
Well, yes, one more. Sorry, Beth.
Sure, no problem.
Do you normally find out about these from the accrediting body, things like that they discovered it and notified you, or is this from your own internal?
It would be a combination. I wouldn't say we normally find it out from accreditors. We have a strong investigative unit that sends the cases that reach the level for an accusation to us.
Okay.
We do monitor and coordinate with the accreditors and the actions that they take.
Okay.
What does in-house default mean?
It means that a school did not show up to a hearing, and there was not a prove-up of the facts, so the Attorney General will do the default, and then it will result in a revocation, a default revocation. Okay, moving on to cite and fine. Page 27 to 29. As you can see so far, up through October 31st, we've had an increase in our citations over 100%. So that the staff in the cite and fine unit, we added a cite and fine analyst. We're working diligently to move through the citations. And on page 28, there's a breakdown of the allegations for the citations.
I think it's important to make note of what Beth just said, that we're up 100%. That's, if you look at the sheet on page 27, and if you look at the citations issued from 2017 to 2019, I think that is a part that people should really take notice of in regards to the work that the Bureau's been doing.
I have a question about that. Sorry, I got to keep my space for the mic. I'm one of the newbies, so maybe others understand this in a way that I don't, but what explains that huge jump? Is it, can you explain that a little bit, provide some context?
Certainly, yes. Part of it is we've added a citation analyst. The other part is just the hard work that we've been doing. We had the assistance of Division of Investigation come in. We've streamlined our cases. We work, the citation unit is working well with Beth's unit to streamline and be more efficient in our cases. So it's just efficiencies and hard work of the staff and setting goals for the staff. And, and we added a citation analyst, which of course helps, but it's just looking at the entire process. Through our mapping of our process, we were able to streamline.
So around this time last year, we did a huge reorg, and I think that also played a key effect into why you see things that are changing. And I think the work that the enforcement team has been doing with some leadership and some guidance from the Department of Investigation has helped us be able to dive deeper, but also be even more efficient in the way we're handling some of these citations.
So then what I'm trying to understand is these citations, it's more a matter of citations should have been issued, but because of the lag in process, they weren't issued as much as they are now, or?
Not exactly. Our citations are not aged, really. They're issued pretty quickly after our inspections are up, and our investigation, is sending more cases through more timely. So, of course, some of it was some of the backlog, but a lot of it is newer stuff too. There's not a lag between when it's identified and when the citation is issued like there used to be. So they're not as aged. So since our citations our inspections are also up over 100%, it's going to create more issues that we're finding and more citations.
Thank you.
Does that help? Okay.
Beth, how many different schools might this represent, these 384? Because I can just imagine if you're at an unapproved institution, they probably haven't paid their Strif. They probably have a number of issues.
Well, no, if it's unapproved, then the citation is for unapproved. They're not.
Okay.
So are you talking about the breakdown?
Just an idea. You've got 384 issues. I don't know if this represents 384 schools or if it represents 10 schools that really have problems.
Yeah, the citations are typically, aside from the unapproved, they have multiple issues. So if a school is not up on their Strif, they could also not be paying their annual fees, or they could have records violations, so it's all one citation with different counts. So the breakdown of how many schools that is indicative of would be hard to tell from this. I could break it down further, but
A gut feel would be, if it's not 384 schools, it's something.
No, it's not 384
No, it's not.
schools. Yeah.
It's at least 72 unapproved institutions.
exactly, yes.
Probably teaching fondue. And
Tequila and taco night.
I have a question. The category announced and unannounced compliance inspections.
Okay, we're going to,
I mean,
okay, moving on to,
no, I'm on
Oh, are
page
you-
28 on that list of allegations. Down towards the bottom.
the citation was a referral from an inspection.
So the others listed here were not?
No, I'm sorry. That is the new refusal to allow us to inspect. Yeah.
Do you have any, off the top of your head, kind of estimate of how many schools we're talking about from this list?
On my next chart, I have a breakdown.
Okay, thanks.
Moving on to compliance stats on page 31. From January to October, there was 17 inspections canceled, which is a combination of the school closed during the inspection and didn't notify us, or refusal to inspect. We are having some of that, which results in some of those citations. Or the renewal to operate was denied in the midst of the inspection, so we'll let that process play out. So it did increase in that area because our inspections increased, so we identified more of those during that time frame.
I'm sorry, I meant, as to this whole list of the allegations, the 384, do you have an off the top of your head idea of about how many
4 or 5.
schools
4 or
that
5.
represents?
Of refusing to let us
No,
inspect?
no, of all of the 384 allegations.
It was the same
Oh,
question
that was the
I
same
asked.
question that Robert just asked.
Yeah.
Question was, do you have
Yeah,
it off the
I
top of
don't
your head?
have, I
see.
don't. It would be a guess, and I don't have that. I don't have it broke down any further than that. It's something that I could do, but
What's your guess?
Yeah, I would rather not guess on this.
yeah,
this one.
All right.
Could you include that in your future reporting, please?
certainly.
It's obviously a question of curiosity, so
Certainly.
Yeah.
I'll do that. Okay, moving on to compliance inspections, page 31. So our inspections, as I mentioned, I'm happy to report, have increased over 100%. And we have a breakdown here. Like I mentioned a minute ago, we have 17 inspections canceled during that time frame. We have 3 new compliance inspectors that are in training, doing fantastic. We have our last new position filled to start December 1st. So she'll be here, will be fully staffed, and only anticipate these numbers increasing.
I just want to compliment you all on the drastic increase in unannounced inspections. I can only imagine that those are more likely to uncover things that people don't want you all to see, and I think that's important. So,
Thank you. And that's the end of my report. Is there any more questions?
And Natalie, just real quick to the point that you made in regards to the inspections. The Bureau was invited to CAPS to give a presentation at their annual conference. And one of the institutions in the crowd actually stood up and said, hey, how many people in this room have had unannounced inspections by the Bureau in the last year? And I would say easily 80 to 85% of the people raised their hand. And then she followed up with, that was a positive experience with the Bureau. And that was a huge point that tied into this. So I think that, just once again, that's great work that they're doing in that department.
Yeah, I agree. I compliment you on that great increase, and
Thank you.
it's what we've been needing to see, and I'm glad to see it. And I won't ask the question I always do.
Thank you. Yes, I would have been able to break down those stats further for you guys had I not been so busy inspecting.
Solid, Beth. That was solid.
Thank you very much.
Hey, I'm Beth Danielson, and I'm the Enforcement Chief over Complaint and Investigations, and I'm here to talk about those statistics. If you look at page 33, I'm looking at the second chart, which indicates that in the third quarter of this year, we closed 345 complaints, which brings the total complaints closed in quarters 1 through 3 to 1,523. This is 91% more than all the complaints that we closed in 2018. In the third chart, of the 1,523 cases that were closed, 11% were referred for citation, 1 was referred for disciplinary action, and 89% were unsubstantiated, compliance obtained, mediated settlement, or non-jurisdictional. I will note that in the third quarter, we have switched to, rather than the investigator or the manager making a decision before it goes to the discipline unit, whether it's going for an allegation or for a citation, it goes to the discipline unit with a recommendation, but then the discipline unit, myself and Beth, look at it to see whether or not it is going to move forward for a citation or for an allegation.
Is the aggregation of unsubstantiated, compliance obtained, mediated settlement, and non-jurisdictional, is that a weakness in your data structure, or why are those all grouped together, given that they're materially different?
So I can give you a breakdown now for those. It's much more of a manual process because of the database that we're using, but I was able to break it down further. So out of those 89, 41% were unsubstantiated. And this is another code. We're moving into a new data system,
Right.
which is going to be a while, but this will be changed, so it will be more clear to the, I would like to call this unable to confirm a violation. So this would be where there was no basis for the complaint when it came in the first place. And this may be something that we know immediately there was no.
I'm sorry, when you say this, are you referring to the first column or the second column?
I'm sorry, I don't have it broken down on here.
Okay.
I'm breaking down that 89% for you now, though. So
Okay, got it.
within that 89%, there is, and you'll see it on the next chart, on the next page, 41% were unsubstantiated, no basis for the complaint. And this may be where a student is not necessarily happy, but they don't have a right to a refund. They've completed the program, were able to test, get whatever they needed to do, but they didn't think they got a good education. That's an example of that. 16% of that 89 had insufficient evidence to confirm a violation. So this is when we've conducted an investigation and there might be some validity to the complaint. However, there wasn't enough to confirm or to meet the burden of proof for a violation. 14% were non-jurisdictional. 6% were closed as compliance was obtained. 5% were closed as consolidated cases. So an example of that would be if we get 15 anonymous complaints for the same thing for the same school, they're consolidated into a single case. 4% were closed after being referred to another agency, and 2% were closed as they were against exempt institutions.
Can I ask a
Could you
question?
tell me what that 41% was again, the first one you mentioned?
That's the, what I'm going to call unable to confirm violation, which will be the first in the chart on the bottom of 34. And that's, the student isn't necessarily happy, but there's nothing that is breaking the Bureau's regs.
Can I ask a question about the unsubstantiated number? Do you further track the reasons that something is determined unsubstantiated? Is there a further breakdown of that number?
There's not.
Okay.
No, there's not. Other than what I said between the 41 and the 16, between there really wasn't a basis for the complaint or it was investigated and it was determined that there wasn't enough to confirm a violation.
I just want to note that maybe this is those of us who are the consumer advocates on this committee. I think I understand, I read the legal memo about not disclosing investigative files. I think there is some sense that we can't properly oversee how these complaints are being resolved if there isn't a little bit more information about the decisions that are made. So if there could be a breakdown, I think that would help.
Well, among the 41%, those you could probably make, I don't want to say 100% of that 41%, but you'd probably make the determination by seeing the complaint and seeing the closure, which is what we can disclose.
Okay.
You can see the complaint and see that it clearly isn't something that is within the Bureau's jurisdiction. So it's not, I don't think what you really are interested in seeing is what the Bureau did in between there, if that makes sense, because you can see that the complaint isn't.
It's obvious from the face of the complaint.
Right,
Okay.
right. Again, a student's unhappy about something, or not even necessarily a student. Parent didn't want their child to go to that school, doesn't think they're going to get a good education, but there's no basis for a complaint to begin with.
I'm not going to request all those right now, but yeah, okay.
Does that make sense?
It does.
Okay.
Beth, this is a small thing, but your percentages, I think there's something being wrong in just your calculation.
Are you looking at the 89, 11, and 1?
Yes.
Yeah, so it actually is. So if you look at the number 20 at the bottom,
Yes.
so those are cases that we currently have at the discipline unit that have not been issued, a citation hasn't been issued, they haven't gone to the AG yet, they're being worked through at the discipline unit. So if you remove that number from the 1390 which is the 89%, it's actually 88%.
So 1390 minus 20 is 1370 divided by 1523?
And they're also rounded from like 0.8 or to a whole number.
All right. I'd still look because it's either 90 or 91%. It's just
90 or 91, the number that you're coming up.
yeah. I just put whatever the numerator would be 1390 or 1370 over 1523.
Okay, I'll look at that.
Hi, Beth. I have a quick question. In looking at the chart on page 33, I think it's really, obviously it's a dramatic interpretation, it's really a dramatic increase when we look at the year-to-year complaints closed. So obviously, congratulations on increasing that tempo.
Thank you.
I'd like to understand when we look at July and August, if you can explain a little bit how that op tempo drops, and I know some of that's from the task force closing and folks coming onboarding your investigators, but can you just expand upon that a little bit?
I think you hit the nail on the head.
Okay.
The task force left in June. I came in the middle of May. Our special investigative team came in, depending on, some of them came in August, some came in September. We were down a manager starting in June. So all of those collectively.
Got it.
And also, a lot that was closed out by the task force, not by the task force, by us and the task force through Q2, was a lot of backlogged cases. So now we're getting into, in my mindset, we're getting into real numbers. And, it picked back up because of the additional staff.
Got it. Thank you.
Sure. Okay, moving on to page 34. During the first 3 quarters, our days to close cases continues to decrease. During this period, 41% of the cases we closed were closed within 180 days, which is up from 36% in quarters 1 and 2 and 29% in 2018. And in Q3 alone, after hiring a dedicated intake analyst, we were able to close 68 cases, which is 19% of those at intake. These were cases that, under the old intake process, would have been erroneously assigned to an analyst. So these are a lot of the cases that we were talking about in that 41% that came in, maybe not in the 41%, but those that were closed in the 89. Either there was no basis for a complaint, it was non-jurisdictional. So now I have an analyst at that desk who looks at it, sometimes even makes a phone call or two to see whether or not this is something that should be assigned to an investigator. And she makes the decision as to whether or not that's going to be. She doesn't make the decision. She then asks her manager, and he makes that decision. So all intake cases now come through one central manager, and the decision is made by him as to whether or not it's going to be assigned, what classification it's going to be assigned to, or whether it's going to be referred to another agency or closed at intake. So that process alone has really helped with the efficiency in the unit. And if you look at the second.
Excuse me, I have a quick question.
Sure.
How do you calibrate that person's judgment? Where's the second set of eyes that periodically would check in and see if that sheep and goat separation is effective and
Well,
accurate?
the intake analyst goes to the manager, who then makes the decision. If there's ever a question, then it comes to me.
Got it, thank you.
In the second chart on 34, the unsubstantiated count is up about 10%, but I relate this to what I just discussed about these cases being closed immediately at intake. So before, it would take a while for this to play out because we had cases that had been assigned to an analyst that sat for months, if not years, that should have never been brought in the door in the first place. Okay, moving on to page 35. The first chart, looking at Q3, July, August, and September, you can see that we continue to receive more complaints than we did during the same period of 2018. And looking at the second chart, the 5 allegations remain the same as they were in quarters 1 and 2, and voucher fraud, which was new in quarters 1 and 2, continues to be among the top 5 allegations.
How many of these complaints, because some of these are internal complaints, right?
Yeah,
because you've got more inspections, so you've got more complaints, but that should happen with more
I do
visits.
have broken down what our current pending caseload and what the origination of those complaints
Thank
were.
you.
Sure.
What is the voucher count, fraud voucher count? What is that?
Well, that is the number of allegations that we've received that involve voucher fraud.
What's a voucher fraud?
So students can receive vouchers for retraining if they've been injured on the
Voc
job.
rehab,
So
okay,
you're
voc
right.
rehab.
So the voucher fraud from our end, usually this involves a criminal case, and the voucher fraud from our end can be one of many things. Usually it involves students being charged too much for a specific course because schools are charging them whatever they need to charge them to get the full amount of the voucher, which generally is about $6,000. So it might be a course that everybody else is being charged $3,000 for, but because they know they're going to get the voucher money, they're charging more.
You've got about 100 of these. Is it?
Correct.
Could that be 100 students at one school, or is it?
It could be. It's not. I don't know. And with
Gotcha.
Beth, I don't know the exact breakdown. There are several schools, not 100.
Thank you.
But yes, we frequently do get multiple complaints from one school.
Okay.
Page 36. So this chart represents our current case, or the caseload as of the end of September, which would be the end of Q3. You can see at the end of Q3, we had 294 cases pending. I am going to talk about what our numbers were as of last Friday, November 15th. As of Friday, the 15th, we were at 240 total complaints. And I will give you that breakdown, David. Of those 240, 55% are direct from external complaints from students. 33% are other external, which could be parents, referral from another agency, external tips. And in regards to external from another agency, 6 of that 33% were student originated, but the student contacted another agency who then contacted us. So it wasn't a direct student complaint, it came from another agency. And then 12% of those are internal tips. And that's from staff. That could be from an investigator that was out and talked to a student, or that frequently comes from compliance or licensing somewhere else within the house.
How do you, hi. That's okay. How do you define urgent? What makes?
So the classification of is statutory. So an algorithm has been determined. So when it comes in and it's put into the spreadsheet there's many different characteristics that determine. I mean, anything from what kind of complaint it is, the school on monitoring through their accreditor. There's many different facets that make that up. It's not something we make up.
It's in the statute?
Correct,
Okay.
yes.
Thanks.
I have on occasion, I won't ever lower that to, if it says it's urgent, I'm not going to lower it to a low priority, but I have and will make it more urgent, yes. Even if it doesn't show that it should be, if I've got reason to believe that we need to be out there quicker. So, and we'll talk about that because we've been able to do that.
Do you happen to know off the top of your head which is the statutory provision that has those priorities? Or does anybody here, just for the
Not
new
off the top
folks?
of my head.
Okay,
Top of
well,
my head.
we can get that.
Yeah.
We'll follow up.
Okay, so back to our pending caseload. 47.1% of the cases are 0 to 90 days old, and this is up from 30% in Q1 and Q2. 20% of our cases are 91 to 180 days old, which is up from 16% in Q1 and Q2. So you can see the newer cases, our percentage in those areas are going up, and our percentages in the aged cases is going down. 10.8% of the cases are 181 to 365 days old, which is down from 21% in Q1 and Q2. 22.1% of cases are over 365 days old, which is down from 31% in Q1 and Q2, and 55% in 2018. And I do want to add that of these cases that are over 365 days old, 6 of those cases I have on hold because they're pending a criminal investigation by an outside agency. So if our investigation is going to impede in a criminal investigation, that's a conversation that we will have as to whether or not we're going to move forward or wait pending the outcome of the criminal investigation. So if you don't include those 6 cases, we've got 19% of the cases are over a year. And the 2 cases on the chart, first chart on page 36 that are over 5 years old are no longer there. They have been referred to the discipline unit for further action. So as of today, we have no cases over 4 years old. I also want to add that our current caseload for analysts and investigators is 15 to 20, which is down from 50 to 75 in 2018. There we go. It is 94941, complaints, investigations.
What is?
Thank you.
The
code that
section
she- the
regarding
section that
urgency.
Requirements and statute are in at code
94941.
94941.
It's subsection E, I think.
Yeah.
Just found it.
Yep. Okay, that's all I have. Are there any questions? I did want to add as far as student impact in Q3, among other accomplishments, our investigators' advocacy on behalf of the students resulted in $40,044.83 in refunds to students or to their federal student aid account. And that brings the total so far in quarters 1 through 3 to $118,869.77. Anybody have any questions there?
Yes, after that total, you have restitution for 3 students in the amount of $52,000 each. Is that included in the $118,000 or in addition to?
No, because that order has happened, but those students haven't necessarily been refunded that money. That's not included in that amount.
What kind of school was the 3 students at 52K?
Was it the same school? All 3 students
Yes.
at the same school?
Are you trying to figure out what type of school?
Accredited, non-accredited?
Oh, we know that right offhand?
I don't know that off the top of my head. And I know this wasn't on the agenda past the statistics, but if you're interested, I thought I'd give a little 2-minute spiel on what our special investigative unit has done.
If it's not on the agenda, we can't discuss it, so
Okay.
sorry.
We'll put it on the agenda for next time, so you can
Sure.
give us your spiel.
Sure.
Wouldn't be so strict if it weren't a misdemeanor to willfully violate the Open Meeting Act, so that's why.
Then we'd have a
It's
whole
just a
new spiel.
misdemeanor, yeah.
Is there a warning the first time?
Thanks, Beth and Beth. Good job.
Thank you.
Yeah, great job. Thank you both. So I think the one item, which was B, Romanet 1, was the one that Noreen was going to present on, so we'll hold that one until after whenever she gets here.
Can I just mention also, there's Regulation 75300 that talks about priorities in addition to those under the statute, just FYI. 75300.
Christy, should we do a public comment at the close of that, or should we wait until we finish with the reports from the Bureau staff?
I mean, usually we do it after each item, so if you want to hold them to the end, you can, or if you want to take it after each subsection, that's fine.
I think, well, we already missed one, so we might as well just wait till the end. So up next is the licensing report.
Good morning.
Morning.
I'm Marina O'Connor. I'm the licensing chief for the Bureau. So the first item under licensing starts on page 39. It's the licensing application status as of October 1st, 2019 for fiscal year 1920. There's just a couple things I'm going to point out on this page. First, under the column titled Pending Assignment Queue, that first row, new full approval applications, you'll see there's 19 pending assignment. 11 of those are incomplete applications. Those are applications where we cannot proceed with processing them until they become complete. And the school's application can remain incomplete for up to a year before it's abandoned. So once it becomes complete, once they submit whatever documentation's missing, we can move forward with processing that application. Another thing I'd like to point out is under the under review column, kind of one of the middle rows, renewal accreditation. So those are renewal applications from approval by means of accreditation institutions, you'll see there's 30 under review. I just want to point out that 9 of those applications are pending a new term of accreditation. So that's when the school is going through the renewal process with their accreditor, and they're awaiting a new term of accreditation so that we can move forward with our renewal application. And then if you'll see at the chart below that titled Total Pending Applications by Date, that shows the change in total pending applications over time from May to October 1st. And you'll see it's been increasing slightly over the last 5 months or so. And those are applications that are under review. So the analysts are working on those applications. They're going back and forth with the schools, working on remediating deficiencies. So they are, actively engaged and working on moving those applications forward with the school. And then the box below that, oldest pending full applications as of October 1st, 2019. I wanted to point out, you'll see that first row, oldest full apps in queue. That's the receive date, October 2nd, 2018. But again, as I mentioned before, we can't work on the application until it becomes complete. In this case, the oldest application that became complete in that queue was from September 30th, 2019. So in reality, it's only about a month and a half or 2 months of applications once they become complete, waiting to be assigned to an analyst. Any questions on that page or that chart?
Maria, just a question about how many analysts are currently on staff and what's their caseload?
Of filled positions, to go off the top of my head, I believe we have, about 14 filled. I want to say 14 filled, maybe minus 1 or 2 if I'm off, but about 14 filled analyst positions. It's staff service analyst positions and associate governmental program analyst positions.
Okay.
But if you count the vacant positions, I believe there's a total of 17.
Okay. So they're all carrying
It's 16 or
about
17, sorry, I might be off.
15 to 20 applications each ish.
If you're looking at the total pending?
Yeah.
Yeah, about, that's correct. Any other questions on that page?
How does a school know if they don't have a completed application? You've got to look at it to tell them, hey,
Correct.
you're missing something.
Right. So the application form itself is broken down into sections, and there's all the sections have to be completed, or there has to be a document provided to complete that section. So we do a cursory review to make sure we have something for each section of the application. And if we don't, we send them an application incomplete letter outlining what exactly is missing and what would need to be submitted in order for us to move forward with the application review.
How many letters might they get like that? I mean, when you see you're missing something, you keep doing the cursory to let them know, hey, you're missing 3 things, not
Correct.
one. Okay.
Correct, right. It's a back and forth. And if we haven't heard from them in 5 months or so, we'll email or call them to check in and make sure they're still working on it and still want to proceed with the application. And any other questions on that page? Okay. Moving on, the next chart, you'll see page 40, starting with page 40 and going to page 43. The first chart at the top, it says 12-month new non-ACC stands for accredited, non-accredited app overview. This just provides an overview of, again, what we call the full applications, but they're the approval to operate an institution, non-accredited applications. A 12-month overview of these applications received, completed, and pending, just to give an idea of the 12-month progress. And you'll see in the pending column, the pending has been coming down since May, and the analysts are, continually working with, like I said before, on schools on moving those applications forward the best we can as long as the school is engaged and working with us on that. Any questions on that chart? Okay, the next chart is just a 3-year overview of the full applications received, just to see, so you can see where we were at the same point in time over the last couple of years. You'll see the received has gone down compared to this point in time, the last year and the year before. And it's, remains to be seen if it'll stay low, but as you'll see in these charts, it goes up and down throughout the year. It's fairly inconsistent throughout the year, so that definitely helps with us moving applications forward when we have less applications coming in at a point in time. Any questions on that chart?
You don't happen to have it broken total by year, do you?
By total by fiscal year?
Yes.
So total apps received? No, I mean, I would just have to do a quick,
All right, no problem.
yeah, add up of the row at the bottom. Yeah, not off the top of my head. We'll add a calculator really quick. And then the next chart, page 42, are these full applications completed over the last 3 years. And of course, as the applications received and pending has gone down, completed, goes down with it. But we're still moving, applications forward, as diligently as we can, working with the schools on those deficiencies. And any questions on that chart? Okay, and the last chart for this section is just that 3-year overview of pending applications, which I've already discussed has been coming down since May. Maybe it'll hold. Let's see where it's at for, September. I don't have October months stats with me, but it'll probably maintain around there for a little while, but I anticipate it to continue to come down. Any questions on that chart? Okay, and then the last item is on page 44. This is a breakdown of the total number of schools by location type and approval type. Location type, by location type, it's broken down between mains, branches, and satellites for a total of 1,955 locations. There are, of that, 1,041 are main locations, 381 are branches, and 533 are satellites. And then below that, you'll see the breakdown by approval type. So ABMA is approval by means of accreditation, 438 institutions approved by means of accreditation, 563 have full approval, 0 conditional, and 40 provisional approved schools. And then the text below that just provides a little more information on what a conditional and what a provisional approval are. And then the box below that just provides those numbers over time as they've been reported to the committee. And the only thing I was going to point out on there is if you look at the number of main locations as of October 1st, 2019, compared to roughly this time last year, it has come down just a little bit for the total mains and branches, but satellites, slight increase. But really overall in the last year, not a whole lot of significant change in any of those numbers. Any questions on anything on this page?
Does this include any distance or online schools?
It includes all schools approved by the Bureau, so that have some type of approval with us.
And we do have, so this could include a school from Delaware.
Well, so out-of-state registered schools would be different. They're not captured on here.
Okay, maybe that was my question.
Yeah.
They're not considered approved, right? Yeah.
Correct, right.
Right.
We differentiate between the out-of-state registration and the approvals.
But this could, to David's point, include an online institution who's headquartered in California but doesn't have a physical campus here.
Correct. Well, they would have to have a physical presence,
Location,
right, in California.
That could be an office or whatever if it's the headquarters.
And
right?
they could be offering distance education as well, right?
A couple of questions for future reporting. Would it be possible to get a breakdown on the registered schools for the future?
Yeah,
especially that's going to come into play more. I think it's a new legislation. And then, do you have a breakdown for prior years before 2018 as to type of location and/or type of approval? Or is that difficult to
the-
pull up?
The only thing I can think of is in the annual report, how these numbers have been, DCA has an annual report where we've reported licensee population information. So we might be able to pull some information from that. I don't know, off the top of my head, I don't think it's broken down maybe exactly the same way. Like, I think it might be by location type, and I don't remember if it's by approval type as well, but we might
I'm
be able to pull
conscious of Beth's comment earlier that the more we ask you to report, the less time you have to work. But
Thank you for saying that. Make sure that's on record, everybody.
So caveat, if it's not too time consuming to get those stats for prior years,
Sure.
I think that might be useful as we go forward towards reauthorization.
Okay.
But if it's time consuming, no, it's not that important.
Okay.
Then on that point, does this include the ESL schools now? The English as a second language? Because I think they used to not include that in years past, but I think you've started to do those schools as well.
You're talking about the number of approved institutions?
Are they approved?
If an ESL program, as long as, it doesn't fall under an exemption, would fall under, the Bureau approval, assuming it meets all of our other definitions of post-secondary education.
When I asked the question, I saw all these questioning looks. I'd like to, I never asked that question, don't worry. It was a dumb question.
Oh, sure. Yeah. Margaret, to your question, how far back would you like the population data?
However far back it's easy. So if you can go back certainly to the last reauthorization, or if you could go back to when this statute came into effect. That's quite a few years back. I think that's 2010. So if that's a hassle, I wouldn't do it. If you can go that far back without a lot of trouble, that might be useful.
Okay.
To really make it interesting then, because to be able to see it by accredited and non-accredited going back, because what type of schools are we getting?
Well, of course, this is just showing the approval type. There could be institutions that have a full approval but are accredited. And so that would be a different type of reporting.
You've got the full approval type accredited and then non-accredited.
So there are just pathways to approval. So I can apply through the full approval pathway, but I could be an accredited institution applying through that pathway. You don't have to be non-accredited to apply that pathway versus ABMA, approval by means of accreditation. You do have to be accredited to apply to that pathway.
I think that would be good enough.
Okay.
Yeah. Do you understand?
Okay, any other questions? Okay, I just wanted to just wrap up real quick by saying that, this is a good snapshot of the work the licensing unit does, but as you see, they have a lot of applications that come through the unit, and there's always, new issues that come up, and they're a very hardworking group, and I just wanted to thank them for their efforts, because this is all them, and they work very hard to work with, schools that have deficiencies and making sure they understand the laws, statutes, and the regs. And they've made a lot of efforts and a lot of progress in having that information available to schools so they can, be more prepared to apply and get through the application process quickly. So I just wanted to thank my staff because they've been working very hard on this. So thank you.
All right, and I also just real quick would like to thank you, Marina. This is Marina's last meeting. She will be transitioning from the Bureau to bigger and better things. Marina was actually my first hire at BPPE, and I can't thank you enough for the work that you've done in licensing, following up from the work that Lisa did, and just continuing the tradition to push that area forward and doing great work. So thank you, and best of luck to you in your future. You always have a home if you need to come back.
And thank you to the committee and Dr. Marion and Lisa for everything. It's been wonderful. So thanks,
Thanks, Marina. Yeah. Good luck.
All right. Thank you.
All right. Last but not least on the Bureau reporting agenda, Mr. Valverde, Office of Student Assistance and Relief report. Ms. Here for moral support.
Good morning.
Morning.
Again, Scott Valverde, Chief Office Student Assistance and Relief. I would like to, with the chair's blessing, go a little bit out of order on the items, only in that D3 and D4, we'd like to flip those if possible, because Lisa will be covering D4, so that way I can just go through my own.
You have my blessing.
Thank you. So OSAR continues to facilitate the duties as outlined in statute, assisting students in accessing federal and state relief programs and conducting student outreach and related activities. And so what I'm going to be reporting to you will be page 45 and 46, which is the summary of our outreach activities beginning with this fiscal year. And so that will cover both of my first two items. We'll be speaking to this document, which is our outreach activities and also our school closure outreach and activities. So what you're looking at are a total of 34 events, 21 of which are under our informed decision component. That's why I like to call it, because that's the language that statute uses, but it's essentially anything, any of our activities other than closed school events. So we're talking college fairs, workshops, student veteran events, et cetera. We've had 21 such events. We've had 9 school closure events this fiscal year, and we have 4 events scheduled in the future that are on the second page. And so I'll start on the proactive outreach side or informed decision side. I'm going to bring your attention to 3 particular events. Obviously, we're not going to go through all of these, but there are 3 that are a little bit unique that I'd like to speak to briefly. The first of which is the event that was held on July 30th in San Diego, what we entitled our Strif Acceleration Workshop. And for new members, I reported on this briefly at the last meeting. I wanted to give everyone a little bit of an update on that. We're pretty happy with how that happened and how that turned out. Essentially, this was an idea to sort of take the assistance that OSAR provides to students, specifically who are working on their Strif claims or have some issues with their Strif claims, or in obtaining documents to support their economic loss or eligibility, and or were unable to attend one of our on-site events when the school that they attended closed. We picked San Diego as the first geographic area to do this because it was particularly hard hit in the Education Corporation of America and Dream Center closures that happened late last year and early this year. And so these were pre-arranged one-on-one appointments for anyone who needed our assistance. We met with 25 students, and to date, we've had 21 Strif claims come in as a result of those meetings, of which 17 have already been approved, hence the name Strif Acceleration. So we're pretty happy with that, something that we want to replicate in the future. It's a model that we'd like to replicate in the future. As I get to my school closure outreach update, the good news is you'll see that there have not been a lot of significant closures or big closures since the 2 that I mentioned, which is obviously good news from a student standpoint. But we're ready to go as needed, and could implement that model in the future as well.
Scott,
yes.
how do students become aware of these
Yep.
workshops?
So various communication channels. One, we had the rosters that were provided by the school or that we obtained post-closure for all the sites in San Diego, the Brightwood and Art Institute sites. So we reach out to those students directly via email and phone calls. We also put the information on our website and also out through social media. And based on the one-on-one appointments that we had there on site, a lot of it was through word of mouth.
Okay.
Scott?
Yes.
I'm wondering, since you were able to track the number of claims that came out of the July 30th workshop, which is great, by the way, do you similarly track outcomes from other workshops that you do?
It's generally done by, it's logged into the system by school and by site by school code. So it would not, we could connect those dots, but the system wouldn't inherently connect those dots in terms of if they came from this particular school, did they come to a workshop or not. We do have that we have that question, and we're going to start trying to track that better in the new data system. But in the current data system, it would take some work. Any other questions on that one? The next one that I wanted to draw your attention to was on September 28th. We did a college preparation workshop. This is the second one that OSAR has developed the content and delivered on our own, basically, although it was in direct partnership with the Natomas Unified School District here locally in Sacramento. We were really happy with this result as well. We had over 100 attendees, mainly high school juniors and seniors and their families or other advocates who came to a Saturday workshop that we provided in direct partnership, again, with the Natomas District's college counseling objectives and sort of their sort of existing outreach structure, where we came in as a partner and developed the curriculum for them for 3 topics, which we did on rotating breakout sessions throughout the day. The 3 topics were paying for college or financial literacy, different types of colleges, and then also the process of researching institutions and making an informed decision. It's very well received. We got a lot of positive feedback. Also happy to report that one of our keynote guest speakers was a member of the advisory committee, Dr. Snowden, and we were really happy that you were there and spoke to the value of education, higher education, and the objectives of OSAR as well. And so that was very well received. Any questions on that event? And then the third one that I'd like to draw your attention to was the Camp Pendleton College Fair on October 18th. This is a very large on-base college fair and other resource fair that's provided annually at Camp Pendleton. I don't have any idea what the total number of attendees is, but it was, definitely in several hundreds, if not thousands. It's one of the largest college fairs held on military installations in California, and the Bureau has historically attempted to and been unsuccessful in participating in that event. And I think through OSAR's efforts and my own personal efforts in terms of building a relationship with not only the California Department of Veteran Affairs, but also the educational liaisons on base, we were finally able to get on to that event as well and participate by having an exhibitor table and, again, talking about OSAR's objectives of informed decision and GI Bill issues. So we're really happy with that one as well. That's it for proactive outreach. In terms of school closures, again, we've had 9 events so far this year. Again, that's a fairly low number, and I think in the big picture, that's a good thing. That means we haven't had as many large closures, knock on wood. But of course, we are staffed and ready to deploy if they were to happen moving forward. I would say the most significant one since the last time we met was a technical college. That's a technical college in Los Angeles. Approximately 125 students were impacted, and we ended up doing 2 separate outreach events for those students, one on-site and one off-site, and Strif claims are starting to come in as a result of that, although a vast majority of those students were funded through a third party, which was WIOA, and we're working with them and with the students on, for the large portion, transferring to another institution and moving on. So that's it on the school closure side. Any questions on that item?
Scott?
Yes.
Thanks so much for the presentation. I just have a quick question as it relates to the efforts that you mentioned at Camp Pendleton and your relationship with Veterans Affairs, and whether or not anything has changed for you or you've been part of any discussions following the decision by the Federal Veterans Administration related to California's approving agency, and if there's any role that you anticipate OSAR playing, or if there's anything you can share about discussions that you may have been a part of following that decision and the ultimate suspension of that contract in October.
Yeah, I am not. I have not had any direct conversation with anyone at Calvet regarding that. I'm aware of the action that was taken. I know Dr. Marianne and Lisa and I have been tracking it. I'm not exactly sure if OSAR would have a role in any sort of outreach regarding the federal VA coming in and serving as the in CFSA's role Can
I
you
think
think
it's
of
more
anything?
just along the lines of the work that you do, obviously, proactively to make
Yeah.
sure that students are aware of their options and,
Yeah.
what schools are approved. And if you're pivoting and doing great work to make sure that,
Yeah.
veteran students are able to utilize those earned benefits, that
Certainly.
they're aware of where those options are and if there's a role for you to play in
Right.
that.
I don't think the partnerships that he's developed are with CSAVE. They're larger than that, so that wouldn't change.
Yeah.
I have some questions, but shall I wait till you get to the end of the?
Now would be fine if, I'm assuming if it's on outreach, yeah.
Well, the first question is on that Camp Pendleton Fair.
Yep.
What other kinds of post-secondary institutions were included in that?
All across the board. There were UCs, CSUs, community colleges, and private post-secondary institutions and independent nonprofits as well were all in attendance. And other education-related resources as well, in addition to just the institutions.
And another question, you said the name of the school is a technical college?
A technical?
A technical, got it. Is that, we had talked last time about you're maybe including legal aid representatives when you have closed school outreach. Were they included in this one?
They were not, but I appreciate you reminding me about that recommendation. And on the next agenda item, I'm going to speak to a conference call that I had with legal aid about another topic. And we did talk about some broad topics outside of just the agenda item as well. So I have been in contact with them, yes.
And have you?
That event was prior to that
Gotcha.
last discussion.
And then on the closed school information, there's no claims paid yet on Art Institute or Argosy, as I read this. Is that just, there hasn't been time for those to be processed? Is that what's going on?
They're in process, yes. And I think Lisa's going to speak to that item. Okay, and then the last one I had was about the Corinthians, the outreach to former Corinthian students, of which many have claims, as you can see from Lisa's handout, still in-house, in the context of and in light of the forthcoming statutory changes that go into effect January 1 that will in part affect former Corinthian students. So OSAR and the Bureau are well aware of and have been tracking AB 1346, which was signed by the governor and put into law effective January 1, changes to both the definition of economic loss as well as changing the eligibility parameters for former Corinthian students to a date-specific enrolled by in 2014 under the current statute, which will now be pushed back to enrolled as of 2010. So we are aware of that, and we have been strategizing about the outreach that we'll be conducting as a result of that change, as well as working with the existing claimants who have filed claims who are pending currently as we evaluate those under the current statute, but will be evaluating them under forthcoming changes to statute effective January 1. So as I mentioned to Margaret, many of those students are, not all, but many of them are represented by Legal Aid Foundation, and we did have a conference call with them since the last advisory meeting to discuss the status of those claims generally, not individually, and then also our strategy around outreach, given the fact that the statute will be changing effective January 1 and will impact many of those students. So we do have a significant number of claims in-house that under the current review by OSAR and then subsequently the Strif unit, and with some guidance from Legal Affairs as well, have confirmed that they are currently not eligible for reimbursement under Strif. However, will be or may be after January 1 based on the changes that I just mentioned. And so we've got them sort of flagged and separated in a separate category. We will be re-reviewing them for eligibility and make sure that we have all the documents and everything necessary to support their eligibility and documentation of their economic loss after January 1, and we'll be prioritizing that review. We'll also be updating all of our web content and outreach content related to Strif eligibility to make sure that it matches the new statute. We're already engaged in internal staff training so that all OSAR staff, and I'm sure all Strif unit staff as well, will be trained on the new changes in the statute and the implementation of those changes. And we'll also be reaching out to all former Corinthian students for whom we have contact information, which is a pretty significant large data set that we've been compiling and updating as we moved along. And I also like to say that we're going to be working with our Office of Public Affairs as well on that outreach strategy to ensure that the outgoing message, or do what we can to control that the outgoing message doesn't come through either looking like spam, which is one of my concerns, or that it would be duplicative to previous outreach messages, given that this is brand new information that could be pivoting students towards that aren't currently eligible to be eligible. So we'll be working on that as well.
Scott?
Yes.
Did you give a number for, I missed it. Was there a number of applications that you think are not eligible now, but maybe after January 1?
I don't have that number handy. It's something
Okay.
I can get. I think Lisa has the total number of Corinthian claims in-house, and they're separated by pending. But of the subset of those that fall into that category, I do not have.
Okay. And reaching out to all former Corinthian students, which I think is great, what is the message? Is it you may be eligible?
Correct.
Okay.
Correct. That's exactly what I was speaking to, is that emphasizing that the eligibility requirements, the eligibility, I guess that's what you would call it, right? The eligibility requirements and the definition of economic loss have changed, and that it may impact you directly. Reach out to us so we can work together to determine that. Will be the message, and the emphasis being that this is not just a secondary reach out from our previous campaign, that this is new information.
Okay, thanks.
I had a question. How is the Bureau understanding the change in the definition of economic loss as to how far back it applies? Is that related to when the student enrolled, when the student filed a Strif claim? What is your?
I think Christy would probably be the best person to answer that question.
My understanding is that it's prospective, the statute's prospective, so anyone that's filing a claim from this point forward would be able to avail themselves of the new definition, but if you've previously applied and were eligible, that definition ruled at that time and governed what eligibility requirements you were able to meet or not meet. So, for instance, in this case that Scott was just talking about, we have a whole new set of students that were not eligible previously and now will be eligible, so they would be availing themselves of the new economic loss definition.
So they would be available using new definition if they hadn't applied previously.
Right.
So if you have two students in the same class, one of who previously applied and one who didn't, the one who, not necessarily Corinthian, but whoever, then the one who applies now would be eligible for a different relief than the one who already applied?
No, I'm talking about eligibility, not whether they applied or not. But at the time, like for instance, the Corinthian students were eligible from 2014 forward under the current law.
Let me forget Corinthian, just because that's kind of a separate thing. But let's say you have two students who went to some other school, and one of them applied for Strif last year, and one of them is applying in 2020. Same issue, same claim. Would the one who already applied and was, let's say, rejected because for part of their claim because it wasn't within that economic loss definition, that's it, they're done, they have no future relief. And the one that applies now would be eligible for that larger definition?
I mean, we apply statutes prospectively. We do not apply them retroactively. So that is my understanding of how the Bureau will be processing them.
Right, I understand you apply them prospectively. It just depends on what you consider what makes it prospective or not. But as I understand it, that's what you're saying, is those two would be treated differently depending on when they filed their claim.
Yes.
Correct.
That was it for me. Any other questions? I'll be here while Lisa speaks to Strif as well.
I'm sorry, I did have one
Sure.
other question. With regard to the Corinthian students you're going to be reaching out to now, you said
Correct.
if you have good contact information for them.
Yep.
I'm assuming that at this point, you probably don't have good contact information for many, many of them.
Yes.
Is the Bureau going to make any effort to try to search
Yes.
for current contact information for them?
Yes, and we did in the first outreach as well. So we've reached out to this data set, if you will, 2 times since I've been on board. Every time we get new information, kickbacks from their email, it generates discussion amongst the former student community. Did you get this? Did you hear this? Someone will call us with a new number, and then we'll update our data, our spreadsheet with that new data. So it's been a dynamic document, and we would go with the most current information that we have.
I guess what I'm asking is, will you be using any search mechanisms? And if so, what kind of search mechanisms in order to try to locate new addresses?
LexisNexis is one that we have an account for and we have access to.
And related to that, on page 47, where you indicate unable to contact, that you had tried email, phone, and so forth, does that apply to those students for which you have good data, good information as far as their contact? Or does that not include students? I mean, I guess you're trying to reach out 3 times, but does that
We
mean
do.
you're reaching out 3 times to information that's no longer connected with the person? Or I don't know for sure what that means, I guess.
Hi, Margaret. This is Lisa Raffretti, and I'll be speaking to the statistics on 47 and 48, so hopefully I'll be able to answer those questions for you. On page 47, you'll see the statistics regarding the Student Tuition Recovery Fund claims. So far this fiscal year, we have received 135 claims. I'd like to point out that on an average monthly, we've been receiving approximately 100 claims a month from the different schools that have closed and the amazing outreach that OSAR has been doing with these students in getting them the information on how to file Strif claims. These numbers continue to increase, so I just wanted to point out that that's a result of OSAR itself. So far this fiscal year, we've paid out 63 claims, and then we have 50 claims that are sitting at the State Controller's Office, and that process at the State Controller's Office is usually anywhere from 60 to 90 days. So we have an additional 50 coming to add to that 63. We've had ineligible claims of 30, claims that were denied of 17, and ones that were closed or unable to contact of 24. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in just a moment, Margaret, for you. Under the current claims, we have 562, which is down from our last reporting, which was at 706. And those claims are going through our triage, and they're being identified if they need additional OSAR outreach, or if they can go straight to the Strif analyst for processing. So they go through a triage at that point, and those are going through the triage there. And then we have 104 that are on the analyst desk that they're currently reviewing and working through. We have 607, which is a large number of ones that we're waiting for students to respond. And this is where we reach out to them at 30 days, 60 days, 90 days. And if they're not responding, we do a LexisNexis research and try to find them that way, and then 30, 60, 90 again if we find a new address or a new contact information. Once we get past the 90 days and we're unable to reach them, we're unable to find additional contact information through Lexis, then we will move to close that under the unable to contact section. However, the students can, if they do contact us, we will reopen their claims and continue to process them no matter what the time frame is. And just a little highlight of that 607, there's approximately 200 right now that are over the 90 days. And so we're working on doing the LexisNexis and seeing if there's any additional information to close those out or hopefully contact the students. Does that help answer that question for you? Good.
And so those 607, I'm sorry, Margaret, those 607 applied initially, right?
Correct.
Okay.
Yes.
Those claims are still open right now. We haven't closed them yet. And we have approximately 180 that are going through the process of finalizing the analysis review and forwarding for recommendations. So we have, over 1,400 claims that we're working on. Again, almost half of those are ones that, that we're waiting for the students to respond on. But we have identified that because of OSAR's, again, I'm going to highlight on their amazing outreach that they're doing because that's why they're here to begin with. We have identified that we need to redirect some resources into this processing of the Strif claims, and we're in the process of doing that with overtime and redirecting staff to help work through these claims and get the money out to the students as soon as possible.
Lisa, do you have similar aging data on those 607 compared to previous? Like, when were those claims originally filed? Do you have an aging
I don't have that
table?
available for me today, yeah.
I have a few questions, but I want to wait till you're finished.
I'm done with that.
Okay.
The only thing else if you want to, is it regarding this front page?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay, go ahead.
So just looking at the data, it looks to me like based on claims received and closed, you're doing well on dealing with recently received claims. But this 1454 it appears to be a backlog. Is that correct?
I don't know if I would consider it a backlog. I consider it, again, half of those are waiting for students' response.
Right.
Almost 200 of those are going through the process for the final recommendations. If you want to call a backlog, I think that the NQ, the 562 that are going through the triage, would be what I would maybe consider a backlog. But then again, if they were just received, it's really not much of a backlog.
Yeah,
I don't have those actual dates available right now.
That's okay. It's just, it's hard to understand the percentages because in recently received claims, a smaller percentage were unable to contact, but maybe that has to do with how old the claim is and how, like, the current contact information you have.
Right. So of that 607, again, there's 200 that are over the 90 days that probably should have been moved up to the unable to contact that just haven't been moved yet.
And when you were talking about triaging the NQ, that's a large number. I don't understand. It's kind of vague to me why it's such a high number and what this triage process is to get it from being so high to being in the later columns of having been assigned and decided.
So those are the ones that have come in, and we have an analyst that specifically looks at the claim to see if it needs to go to OSAR for additional outreach or additional assistance to look at if they require more assistance to get their eligibility or to show their full eligibility. If the claim comes through and it looks like they have everything there and they don't need any further assistance, then it'll go directly over into the Strif analyst. If it looks like it can use OSAR's assistance or they're asking for OSAR's assistance, it'll go over to the OSAR analyst to reach out to the students. And so it's just kind of like a process as it works, what they have on their desk. Nobody wants to come in and have 60, 70 cases on their desk. It's pretty overwhelming. So we try to do it on a flow.
So is this the part where you're trying to increase staffing? Because it seems like
Absolutely.
having one person dealing with 562.
Absolutely. That's where we're going to redirect resources and offering overtime for staff to work through these.
And I think, just jumping in real quick, I think this is also a part that's going to be important for the advisory committee to understand, is that throughout my time being here for the last 2 years, I'm continually moving resources to other areas. So I'm pulling from one area to help one area. And so I'm continuing to do that. And so we're doing the exact same thing for OSAR and Strif. But the reality of it is that you can only do that for so long. If we have a certain amount of closures at one time, it's going to put us in a very difficult situation. And so we have to be mindful of that. It's definitely moving forward that we're going to need more staff for sure.
One more question and then I'm done.
No problem.
I just logically don't understand the 50 payment requested, where that does it fall under one of the numbers already? No.
No, it's a
So
separate
it should
number.
be added to the 63 is
It will be added to the
It will be
63 as
once
soon as
they're
we get the
paid.
checks
I
back from the
see. Okay.
controller's office.
So it will also increase the total.
Correct.
Yep.
I'm sorry, I'm not a math genius, clearly.
That's okay.
What I see is 135 that came in, 134 closed. How does 50
So then the 50 would be added to the 134.
and the 135?
The 135, yes.
Okay, thanks.
Well, the claims that are
Well,
paid
not
in
from the
1920
135,
could
that's
have been
just
for a previous
received.
period. Yeah.
The 135 is received. It would go into the blue box there where it's the total that have been closed.
So they could have been received at another time?
Correct.
I see. Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Lisa, can you give me an example of student response? Like what kinds of things, what questions are pending with a student? So what are you waiting to hear back from them and those 600 students?
Right. It could be proof that they went to the school. It could be receipts for payments that they made that they're claiming. It could be loan documents to show their current balances so that we can pay them correctly.
And so the adjudication of those, let's say they all responded tomorrow, some of them are going to be denied, some of them are going to be ineligible, some of them would be paid then on roughly the same proportion maybe as the
Assuming,
table
yes.
above?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Do you work with the Department of Education and just kind of say, I've got this information from the students? Students don't know how to work the process with the department. Do you just work directly with the department sometimes and say, hey, what's the loan, when did they get the loan, those type of things?
That's those are.
Yes, most commonly we'll work with the student on assistance with accessing the National Loan Servicing Database, which has a lot of that information. So we'll walk them, in many cases, again, it runs the gamut, right? Some have no idea what that means. What are you talking about? How do I get to a computer to even log on to see it? I mean, it's that level of assistance. Others, they have all those tools. They're savvy enough to understand we know what we're talking about. We're walking you through a database to find the information. And it's just literally about getting access, working with the student to get their access. And then the information's all there. If all those fails, yes, we could contact the department directly as well. It's generally easier because we're already working with the student on other issues just to say,
Okay.
let's get on NSLDS and find the number.
And the payment requested from the controller's office, do you have a gut feel how much that total is?
I believe that 50 added to that 63 is going to bring us really close to $1 million.
$1 million
When added to the 63, right?
Correct.
So it's another 500 grand-ish?
Approximately, yeah.
How long is the process at the controller's office? Or did he say the check's in the mail? Or
Yeah, it's usually like a 60 to 90-day process.
Okay.
I'm not sure my memory is correct, but it seemed to me that in the past, in the one of these numbers, like at the in-queue, or basically the claims received, we used to get a breakdown of when those came in, how long they've been pending. And I don't know if that's my memory or I'm thinking of some other category.
I don't
Because-
remember seeing those
okay.
on Strif claims.
Again, if it's not difficult, it would be helpful, I think, based on some of the other comments here, if we could get a sense of how many are from this year, prior years, at least, that kind of breakdown.
We can look into that for you.
Thanks.
Okay, the only thing else I have is just the breakdown of the large impact closures, and that's on page 48. And you can see that we did add the Dream Center and ECA schools as requested.
And also, just one more piece, I think it's important for everybody to realize as well that since 2016, when we had 25 or 28 million and 400, the number continues to go down. And so I think that's important, folks, to know that we are making sure students are getting their money.
Can I ask a question on that? Maybe this is not in the agenda, I'm not sure. Probably not. I'll just ask for that next time.
You can always say no. Of these large schools, I know some of them, the students never paid into Strif because they weren't required to. Has that, Heald never, they were WASC accredited, so they didn't have to pay in.
That's why there's a statutory change to
Right.
allow them.
To allow them, but do they, in the future, would they pay in? Are all schools paying in the future, or is it still going to be?
Only schools that are approved.
Okay, thank you.
Scott, can I ask you a follow-up question on your conversation with LAFLA?
Sure.
I had submitted a question, and maybe this is what I'm trying to figure out if that conversation regards the question I had, which was about eligibility. I know a number of consumer advocates and lawyers have submitted these applications for eligibility based on the Corinthian judgment, state AG case. Is that what that conversation was about?
Yes.
Okay.
That based on our review of many, but not all of those claims, and then subsequently supported by our legal counsel's advice and direction, that they were under the current statute not eligible.
Okay.
But will be in many cases after January 1, and that's why we're going to prioritize those, and that's what was communicated to legal aid regarding their clients.
Your lawyer's raising her hand.
Okay, just to clarify, so the Corinthian judgment from the Attorney General's office was a 17,200, 17,500 unfair business practices, false advertising case, and those cases are typically brought on behalf of the people in general. Sometimes they do include detail about specific economic loss to people who are affected by the unlawful conduct. But in this case, there was no detail about the breakdown of the damage or economic loss afforded each student. And so under current law and regulations, specifically Title V, California Code of Regulations, Section 76212, looking at subdivision D, the judgment has to indicate the amount of the judgment applicable to each student. And so because the Attorney General default judgment didn't include any detail about specific losses for each student affected by their judgment, it's not something we can use to make them eligible. However, if you look at the allegations in the complaint, most of them deal with 2010 and later issues. So we're, based on our current past experience with the claims that have been submitted historically by legal aid and others on behalf of their constituents, we believe that the change in law will cover those students because it will allow students from 2010 forward to file claims if they've suffered a loss and meet any of the criteria generally in the Strif for a student tuition recovery fund reimbursement.
I appreciate that very much. A couple of my concerns are, LAFLA, certainly, I know that they've submitted a lot of those applications, but they're not the only direct services provider. So I feel like it would be useful to have this legal reasoning if that's something I can request. I don't know if it's considered proprietary, but it would be great for those of us, I'm included in that, who are representing people to know where BPP stands on these so that we can adequately advise our clients.
Well, I thought there was a letter that was sent to legal aid regarding the eligibility under current law versus, is that correct, Mr. Smith? Wasn't a letter, or was it just the phone call? I'm trying to recall. I mean, we could always confirm in writing the phone call discussion that was had between legal aid and OSAR regarding outreach and the change in the law. And the Bureau, it's up to the Bureau whether they want to proactively reach out and maybe put a website disclosure out that would, be available, disclosing the change in law and the current requirements for using judgments that are obtained by a government agency. So,
It feels like an agency interpretation that I think, just for transparency purposes, not even take out the attorney for people who might consider themselves eligible based on a judgment to understand, whether their application would be considered a viable application. So I'll leave it at that, but I think it would be a useful tool.
Yep, we'll take a look at it. Thanks.
That question then raises my earlier question, but now with respect to Corinthian, and somebody did submit, like through LAFLA or some other way, an application before and was deemed not eligible because they were before 2014, and they will be advised they can submit one now and they might be eligible. For those, then they will get the benefit of the broadened economic,
Yeah, those claims will be, if we've already denied them or deemed them ineligible, we're going to go back and look at those and see if they would now be eligible, and then we'll relook at the claim in its whole.
Yeah, and back to the conversation with LAFLA, I also, on that call, made it clear that we weren't just going to sit back and wait till January 1 to pull the claims, that we would look at them, we'd work with the student, we'd stay in communication with the student to make sure that all the documentation necessary to prove their eligibility on January 1, that we're working on that now if we don't already have it, and they expressed some efforts to cooperate on that as well, collaborate.
Great, thank you.
Any other questions for the OSAR team? I am going to request a 10-minute break. Well, we didn't even finish this section yet because Noreen's here. So can we take a bio? This is for you, lady. Don't worry. We'll when we come back, we're going to have Noreen address the I think it's 5B1 question, and then we'll do public comment at that point. So it is 11:25. So let's be back at 11:35. And then there's only, after that, a limited number of items left on the agenda, so hopefully we can come back after 10 minutes and power through and be done. So, 10 minutes. Okay, so we have two slight changes to our order here. We have someone who's going to be doing the Bureau update who is on a timing situation that is going to require him to leave soon. So rather than go to Noreen, I'm going to do public comment on Section 5, and then we'll have the agenda item 7, and then we will go back to 5. So I want to accommodate all of our people. So if anyone has public comment on anything that we covered under the Bureau Operations Update, under number 5.
Hello, good morning. My name is Angela Perry with the Institute for College Access and Success. I just wanted to make a brief comment recognizing the accomplishments that many of the reports that we just heard from the Bureau staff represent. There have been increases that really do deserve to be recognized and held up. I also am, I know that we are going to have a discussion about sunset review coming up later in the agenda. Just to follow up on that, I know that there was a lot of discussion about ways that we can continue that momentum and continue making those improvements through staffing, through reorganization, and just wanted to as always, say that TICAS is available to be helpful in any way possible, looks forward to opportunities to work with the Bureau to find solutions and to continue that forward momentum. So just really wanted to recognize those accomplishments and to, as always, offer to be of any assistance. Thank you.
Thanks, Angela. Any other public comment on Section 5? Okay, so we're going to move on to number 7, which is the DCA representative update on sunset review. Welcome.
Hello. Hello. This mic. Good morning. My name is Gregory Pruden. I am a legislative manager here with the Department of Consumer Affairs. Appreciate the committee's indulgence in reorganizing your agenda to accommodate me. As the chair indicated, I am going to speak sort of in a high-level way about the sunset review process that I think the committee is aware the Bureau is currently going through or will be going through in 2020. For those that don't know, the sunset review process is an oversight process that the legislature conducts generally every 4 years for the department and its programs. BPPE is scheduled to sunset January 1, 2021, absent reauthorizing legislation extending the Bureau. Earlier this year, the legislature provided the Bureau with a sunset questionnaire to be completed and submitted. The due date for that questionnaire is December 1st. When the report is approved by the governor's office, it is currently with the governor's office for review at the moment. When it is approved by the governor's office, the department, working with the chief, will submit the report to the legislature. It will also be posted on the Bureau's website. It's my understanding that at that time, December 1st, that the chief will personally email the report, the finalized report, to the committee members. So I want to talk a little bit about timeline, sort of how we got to where we are today. Bureau staff filled out the narrative of that report and provided it to the department in September of this year. The department staff then conducted a review of that report and submitted it to our control agency later that month in September. The report was ultimately approved by agency and subsequently was submitted to the governor's office in October, where it is still being reviewed today. So I want to talk a little bit about the sunset process going forward, since the report is still in review. The legislature, once the report is submitted, will take probably the winter to review it. They don't return from their break. They don't reconvene until, I believe it's January 6th of 2020. Typically a few weeks before the sunset hearing, which this past year, programs undergoing sunset review had their hearings at the end of February and beginning of March. So we would anticipate probably a similar time frame. A few weeks prior to that, the legislature will produce what is called a background paper. It's essentially a summary from the legislature's perspective of the sunset report that was submitted by the Bureau. The Bureau will be asked to conduct a fact check of that background paper. It's not an ask to sort of look at the narrative. It's more of a true fact check about the data and the facts and figures that make up the report. I believe historically that is generally asked to be conducted in approximately 24 to 48 hours, and then the Bureau will provide that fact check back to the committees. Typically around that time, the legislature identifies a set of issues that they expect to be addressed during the sunset review process. Generally, the chief will be asked to personally testify to a handful of those issues, somewhere around 2 to 4 perhaps, but the legislature, in conducting its oversight, can ask any question at the committee hearing that it so chooses. The chief, working with his staff, will prepare written answers to all of the issues, including the issues that he's been asked to testify to. And those answers, those responses need to be approved by both control agency and the governor's office. Unclear, obviously, since we're talking about the future, what the totality of the issues in terms of a number that the legislature will identify, but could be anywhere from 10 to 20. And again, as I mentioned, the chief will need to prepare responses to all of them. Those issues that he is not asked to testify to at the sunset hearing will need to be prepared in a written response and submitted to the legislature within 30 days of that hearing. Again, those responses, all of them need to be approved by control agency and the governor's office. Sometime early in 2020, a sunset bill will be introduced. It likely will not contain any substantive language when it is introduced because the hearing will not have yet occurred. Last year, or this past year, programs going through sunset didn't generally have any substantive language inserted in their sunset bill until around the summer. So we are kind of thinking that might be the time frame going forward into 2020. Again, unclear what the legislature will want to do because we don't know the issues that will yet be identified. But with some of our programs going through sunset this past year, there was sort of a feeling that we received from committee staff that wanted to try to avoid placing controversial language in the sunset bill that might garner significant opposition. Throughout this entire process, the chief and the Bureau will be working closely with the department, both the legislative office, as well as the control agency and the governor's office on both all of the written responses and then any substantive language that is inserted into the sunset bill. Again, very high-level overview of the sunset process. Happy to answer any questions that you committee members may have at this time.
Well, first of all, I just want to thank you for coming in, Greg. I really appreciate it. Greg is actually sick and probably shouldn't be here, but I think it was important for everybody to hear kind of the overall how the process goes. We actually Greg is actually a manager in the office, and we actually have 2 vacancies as the deputy director and the assistant deputy director.
Correct. Yeah, my office currently is without a deputy director, which is a political appointee, and a assistant deputy director. So we would certainly hope that those positions would be filled to assist the Bureau and the entire department's programs going through sunset, hopefully by the end of this year.
I have a question. Thank you for the work you've done in this already. I'm curious, is there any role that the advisory board or we as individual members should or could play in the process?
I think certainly this body is an advisory body, and so certainly you do have, you should opine. I think once language and the issues that the committees will identify are known, I would fully think that you guys would be within your purview to possibly agendize those and discuss them. And certainly the sunset bill, once it is introduced and there's actual language in there, I think you guys could play a similar role in having a discussion about what those changes may or may not mean for the operations of the Bureau.
I have a question, Greg.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you for coming in on a sick day.
Yeah.
I have just 2 questions for you.
Sure.
I hear what you're saying, that what BPP submitted is under review in the governor's office, which I assume means you don't want to talk about what's in it. But I am wondering if you can give us any high-level description or summary of what is addressed in that. And then I'll just tell you my other question too, if I can remember it. Of all the sort of written documents that you just described, maybe you could identify if any of those are non-public. I'm assuming they're all non-public, like the written testimony, all of those things. But if there are any that aren't.
Sure. So I'll take them in reverse order. The testimony, the answers that the chief will be providing both publicly in his testimony and the written responses are non-public and are part of the administrative process. The chief is beholden to the governor, and those answers will not be public until he delivers them, pursuant to the approval from the administration. And the written answers will not be public until they are provided to the legislature. Your first question about sort of a high-level overview of the report. Most of the report is facts and figures. It's licensing statistics, enforcement statistics, that type of information. There's information about committee members, I believe, in terms of attendance, for example, at these meetings. There's information about the nexus that the Bureau plays with other entities and agencies. And then I know something that the legislature has always been, that the committees have always been big on, is toward the end of the report, there's a section about new issues. And historically, I will fully admit that administration has not generally been, the previous administration at least, was not historically okay, if you will, with putting a lot in there about new issues that the Bureau is seeing. Our office does our best to sort of push as much as we can, because I think, as we all know, there are a lot of big issues in this space. It is certainly our intention to include as many of those things from the Bureau's perspective as we possibly can, but I can't speak to any detail about what may be in there because, again, it's still under the governor's office review. But I know that we do have a representative from the committees on this committee, and that is something that we have heard loud and clear from Sarah about trying to tell the committees what it is that programs in this department need and want. And so again, it is our hope and intention that we will be able to include as much of that as we possibly can. And hopefully you'll see that when the report is published.
And that's ultimately decided by the governor's office,
Correct.
right? Okay, thank you.
Last thing I'll say on that is we did our best to include as many of those things as we could, as many of those issues as many of which you guys have talked about today and at past advisory meetings. But ultimately, it's the governor's office call in terms of what remains in the report and what must come out.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I assume the Sunset Questionnaire itself is a public document, is that correct?
The template, I believe, is.
Yeah, if maybe you could just send that around to the advisory committee members, just so we can see what the questions are, even though we don't see the answers yet.
I don't think there's any.
Yeah, let me look into that and
Yeah.
see if we can.
Sure.
Any other questions for Greg? Thank you.
Go home.
Yeah, go home. Have some Dayquil or NyQuil. Even better, have some NyQuil.
Appreciate your guys' indulgence again for allowing me to speak out of order, and want to congratulate you guys all on the good work that you do being here. I know it's not easy traveling for many of you from very far away, so thank you for your service.
Very far away in San Diego. I know, terrible. Okay, any public comment on Greg's presentation regarding the Sunset Review before we move backwards? Okay. So let's go back to 5B, Romanet 1, and this is the question regarding the investigatory, such a weird word, investigatory file that, Noreen, I think you were going to address.
Thank you for agreeing to reorder the agenda for me. I think the committee members all have before you a memo from the legal office that states our position. The committee members had previously asked about getting copies of investigatory files, and it was our opinion then that the committee members don't get access to certain investigative files, and I wish to have an opinion on that, and so I have drafted one with both the help of Mr. Smith and Ms. Shields, and if you have any questions, I'd be glad to answer any questions, but the opinion of our office is that the investigative files, well, for the committee, while it does say has access to the files to the extent a board member does, this committee does not have access to, does not have a provision for closed session meetings because you don't engage in disciplinary matters. And I might add that even in a board closed session, those documents aren't available then either. In addition, they are not public documents. And if we were to disclose them to the committee members, it would be making those documents public, which would have a really large chilling effect and harmful effect on the Bureau's investigations. So that is a kind of a summary of the opinion, and I'd be glad to answer any questions.
I haven't had time to read the whole opinion yet, but just for clarification, it's my understanding, in part on what was provided, based on what was provided to us last time, that you would be able to, or the Bureau would be able to provide us the actual complaints with the private information redacted, correct?
I think that is really a call for the Bureau. We generally do not give out complaints, even with the personal information redacted. That's generally not there's a policy against it.
I think the only exception would be if the complaint had been provided to the institution and those
Oh,
were the-
if they had previously been made public.
made public, right? So if they had been made public, you would be entitled to it, and that's what the sampling was at the last meeting that we reviewed. Those were complaints that were provided to the institution who was the subject of the complaint. And so when you make a disclosure outside the confines of the agency to a member of the public, then other members of the public are also entitled to it, copy of it. We did redact the names of the consumers who filed the complaint to protect their privacy, but you obtained the substance of the complaints with the understanding that the legal standards regarding withholding the documents that are mentioned in this memo had been waived by the Bureau because they disclosed a copy of the complaint to a member of the public, which is the institution.
With respect to complaints that are determined to be unsubstantiated, some of those are not even provided to the institution. Is that correct? If it comes in on the face, the person reviewing it here decides it's unsubstantiated on its face, then that does not even go to the institution. Is that correct?
I think that the Bureau staff could better answer that. I think generally, a general practice is that a summary of the complaint is generally made available to the institution, but for complaints that are non-jurisdictional, they may not get any of it.
That's correct. It may not go to the school at all.
So the complaints that we were provided last time were ones that had already been produced in response to a request for public records by a private party.
I believe that's the case.
Okay, thanks.
Just to follow up on that, so I too skimmed the memo. I've read parts that I thought were important to read to understand it. And it was my understanding, I think this was just confirmed, that the Bureau can waive, they can assert this investigatory privilege exemption, but also can waive by, redacting information and providing documents in the file. It seems as if that's what was done in this instance. Is that right?
I don't know what decisions were made with respect to the previous Public Records Act request. I wasn't counsel at the time, so I actually don't know.
Well, but the ultimate question is, it's not, you can assert it, but you can also disclose and redact anything that would violate some provision on privacy or.
Yeah, the memo, when you have a chance to read it, goes over the two public policy issues behind the privileges, and they really apply to any privilege. So attorney-client privileges can be waived as well.
Right.
But the concept is that the exemptions exist in law for two reasons when it comes to investigations. One is protect the privacy of the parties involved, and that includes not just the consumer that makes the complaint, but the targets of individuals who are targeted in the investigative process. But also it protects the agency's deliberative process and their ability to keep confidential those things that they think could affect other investigations, and that could be tactics, strategies, how they conducted the case. Maybe they don't want to disclose how they reviewed a complaint because they didn't have quite enough evidence, but they could have if they get another complaint that provides additional information. So they don't want the target of the investigation to get any of that information because it could compromise future investigations.
Yeah,
so
I understand
those are all
this.
the public policy reasons why agencies, not just this one, but all of my other clients similarly withhold investigative files under these same exemptions.
Yeah, and I've had many of my requests denied for these reasons, so I understand the bases. I guess, and I'm not saying that they're important considerations. I acknowledge that, but I do think that this highlights a handicap for the advisory committee to actually oversee decisions that are made and understand the bases of those decisions. I just want to express that, we receive statistics and, it's not, I don't think it's our job at all to look at every decision and say, well, you were wrong or you were right here. But I do think there's some oversight responsibility that we have. And I don't know what the other mechanism would be to have some ability to understand how this process is playing out. I leave that, I guess, as a question. It doesn't have to be answered right now, but it's a concern I have.
I have two points. One is, with respect to privacy, redaction can take care of that problem for both the complainant and the institution being complained about. As to giving away investigative methods, et cetera, I think that the ability for that to happen is really slight if all you are asking for is the complaint itself. And here's my thought, and that is, what I think is of concern to me is it seems like there's a fairly high percentage of unsubstantiated complaints. I may be dead wrong on that, but it appears to me that way, and I think it would be helpful if we could look at unsubstantiated complaints to get a sense for what the complainants are saying. And I mention this because having reviewed consumer complaints over many years in my work at the Attorney General's office and before that as an investigator, often in a complaint there will be pretty much 90% that is nothing you can do anything about. And there may be a seed that suggests, there may be something illegal going on, but it's not at all clear from this complaint. On its face, you would dismiss it. And so I think it would be helpful for us if we could, in our advisory capacity, look at some of those complaints that are closed as being unsubstantiated, so we have a better sense of what ones are treated that way. And the other point I would say is if that can't be done, if the Bureau can't waive the privileges that it asserts to allow us to do that, then I think another alternative is, my recollection is there are some boards and bureaus whose complaints are actually made public. Or at least there's been discussion of that in the past. And I think one way that this might be addressed might be to see if there's some legislative way to deal with this, if we can't do it just by a waiver of a privilege, so that we could at least get that information and have a look at it.
Yeah,
Well,
go ahead, Noreen.
As to complaints that are unsubstantiated, I think maybe Bureau staff can explain a little bit better the process that goes on before that decision is made, so that the committee members feel confident that the Bureau is doing its job in reviewing the complaints and reviewing any information that they get with respect to it as a way of engaging in your oversight. I think the other thing is I'm not aware of any boards or bureaus that make their complaints public. I think, to build on what Ms. Shields says, in addition to releasing any personal information, which we would not be able to do, there would be a big chilling effect on the filing of complaints by people who feel like, well, I don't know, if I file a complaint, it will become public, and I'm not willing to make that happen. So there have been quite a few policy reasons why most of the boards and bureaus have decided, or if not all of the boards and bureaus have decided, not to release the complaints, whether or not they're substantiated and closed or result in some action.
Yeah, I may be thinking of, and maybe it's not correct, but maybe I'm thinking of the Department of Insurance on my work with them in the past, but maybe I'm wrong. The other thing is, the problem is I do not feel, they can explain the process, but in looking at the complaints that we did look at, I thought there were many open questions, and the answers could be all, it was handled perfectly fine. I don't know, because I can't tell. But I think having a look at the unsubstantiated would be helpful to us to just get a sense and reassure us that everything is going fine, or if we see issues that maybe we could address that would be helpful to the Bureau. So that's why I think that kind of thing would be helpful. I don't think people, if their complaint cannot be identified to them individually, I don't think they're going to care. Same thing with an institution. If it's not identified to them individually, it's not going to matter to them. So I don't think that the privacy issue is anything to be concerned about if the complaints are redacted. Thank you.
I guess the question I have for you is, and you have received redacted complaints for review at the last meeting, so could the advisory committee, based on those complaints, give the Bureau some guidance on what they think they should be looking at, as opposed to asking the Bureau to give up its investigative files and how its strategies have been employed, that's the part where there's a difficulty, because it's not just the complaints, but the request, it's actually the request for the investigative or deliberative process protected documents that the Bureau has an issue with releasing. And so if you get the redacted complaints, I guess I'm not understanding why the committee couldn't then say, well, did you look at this? Did you look at that? We recommend you look at this, 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 and this. And that would be fulfilling your advisory committee role.
Fine, that's what I was suggesting.
Right. So you received those complaints at the last meeting that were made public because they were released to the institutions. I don't know if there's any other complaints that in that batch that were given out to the Sacramento Bee who made the public records request that we could further provide. But you had asked for a sampling, not for everything that was provided.
Right, I think
So-
I had asked for a sampling, particularly of those that were unsubstantiated.
Right,
And I think we got kind of a mix of things, so the
Right.
number that we got that were unsubstantiated was very small. So I think a larger sampling would be very helpful. And you're saying that it still would have to be something that's already been made public to somebody
Correct.
else?
Correct. It's the ones that have been waived in terms of, like I said, the student checks the box to say, go ahead and share with the school. That is the waiver of privacy that occurs, and then it would be, because it's been waived and given to a member of the public, that complaint no longer contains that privacy protection that other complainants that don't check the box would have. So it's the people that check the box to voluntarily waive their privacy right that would make that complaint subject to public disclosure.
How would we do that? You mentioned making I'm new, so I think I'm still considered new. How would we go about, put aside getting complaints? What the recommendations you're talking about, does we just send an email?
No, it would, if you have the complaints, the redacted complaints that were provided previously, what are the things in your mind that you would think would be important for the Bureau to look at in determining whether a violation occurred? Did they make contact with the institution? Did they make contact with the student?
Yeah, I understand that
kind
part.
of thing. That's what we're looking for from the committee in terms
So,
of
in what form is my question? It's a very basic
at the
question.
committee meeting.
Oh, so come prepared to make
Yes,
those recommendations.
yes.
I see. Okay.
Right, so I did that last time when we looked at those. And, there were a number of complaints, so we didn't discuss every single one, just not to take up a lot of committee time. So I guess, so we submit complaints, but we really don't know how those are then addressed by the Bureau. Or we're not complaints, we submit our comments, but we really don't know how those were addressed. I guess we could submit something in writing and ask for a response. Maybe that would be one way to do it.
It would need to come to the committee, and there would need to be a vote to send comments to the Bureau to consider incorporating into future review of complaints as a formal recommendation from the committee, because anything that comes from the body has to be voted on and passed by the body. So that's why it would need to come to an advisory committee meeting, and you could discuss it and make those recommendations and pass that as a motion orally, or you could do it in writing.
Or I or any member of the public could just send something to the director as an individual.
Right, but for it to be in a committee recommendation, we need the committee to pass that.
Right.
Right.
But I just want to clarify what I think Ms. Shields is saying is recommendations for something like talk to the student, talk to the school, talk to other students in the class, as opposed to, did you ask so-and-so such and such a question? And I don't think that's what Ms. Shields is suggesting, that there's not a kind of a hindsight review of what the investigation was that was conducted.
You're right. And for that reason, I think it would be helpful if we were provided a larger number of unsubstantiated complaints, because the number we had was so small, it's a little hard to come up with generalizations.
You could probably narrow it down into the group that you want to see, just to make it a little bit less work.
Right, that's what I'm saying. Just, just unsubstantiated complaints.
Yeah, so I think we provided a mixed bag of information, so I'll definitely take that into consideration.
Well, as far as the question is how many were provided, I gather the pool we're talking about is what was provided under the Freedom or the Public Records Act request. Do you know how many complaints were provided?
I can't recall how many we submitted, but I know this is an ongoing conversation, and which is why we had this on the agenda.
Right.
And I think we keep on going in circle and circle and circle. And so we're continuing trying to provide the information that's helpful for you all. But I think the big piece that Chrissy said that's helpful for me as a bureau chief and the team is you being able to provide us that feedback based on the information that you've already received would be very helpful before we go back out and try to bring more information. I think that would just be beneficial for us moving forward.
Right, and what I'm saying is there were so few provided that fit that category that I don't think it's easy to give generalized suggestions. What might be helpful so we do move forward is if we could get information as to how many complaints you have in the pool of those that you could provide to us that are in the unsubstantiated category. So we have a sense. Maybe you've provided all you really can provide, or maybe there's a lot more.
Definitely taking consideration.
And I'm sure enforcement staff has spoken and appeared before the committee before to describe what their processes are. I don't know if maybe that would help to have that happen again for some of the newer advisory committee members so that the committee knows, the enforcement staff knows what they're doing and knows their jobs. Frankly, I'm not aware of any board that that overlooks investigations and provides individual comments on particular cases. So usually the enforcement staff discussing their training and their background and their the way they go about their jobs answers those questions.
I think that would be useful. I am new, so maybe that has happened before. And just to be clear, there's not a lack of there's not an assumption that that's not going well. It's
Right.
just being able to know more information about what's happening.
I want to second that. I mean, I have the highest respect for what I am hearing from the enforcement in the compliance investigation, the complaint handling, the OSER, and I've seen dramatic improvements. So my request to see this information is not any kind of a suggestion that people are not doing a good job. It's just to be able to be in a position to say, I see how things are working, and yes, I can say, yes, the Bureau's doing a great job here. This is, they're handling this, they've recognized this, and so on. Right now, I can't do that because I can see that a lot more is being handled, and I think that's terrific. What I can't tell is, how it's working. And that would be, I think, helpful for the Bureau as well if we were able to stand up and say, yeah, we got a good sense of how these complaints are handled, and we're delighted they're doing a great job, whatever. Right now I can say, it sounds like they're doing a great job. They've really improved the numbers. They're really making progress. That's as much as I can say.
All right. Any public comment on this section? Hello, Mr. Johnson.
Got to turn the mic on.
Robert Johnson.
Mic's not on.
Got it?
Nope. Try the other one.
Okay. Right. Unfortunately, that from listening to the audience, that is clearly what is being said here, is that the Bureau somehow is incompetent in terms of the 40% figure that is evidently at dispute in terms of unverifiable complaints. I would just point out, from an institutional perspective, the Bureau has systems, procedures, rules, regulations, guidelines, statutes, interpretations from their council that they operate on as a state agency. At the heart of it, a complaint is an adversarial process. As somebody files something about an institution that they don't like the institution is doing, the institution is obligated to respond. There is a determination whether or not that complaint is valid, and there is a resolution or an appeal. and it can go to several different levels. It does not seem constructive to basically pick out a percentage of complaints that were, quote, unverifiable, that were dismissed based on testimony from the current Bureau today, that on its face, it was instantly dismissible because of some very obvious defect in it. So if you listen to your staff presentation, that 40% is not an undue figure. It was just a defective complaint that was basically misfiled. So to go back and now go through a very extensive process where you take actual complaints, redact information, which often can kind of tell you exactly what the school is about and where it's at. It's not that privacy-based. Even when you do redactions, there are basically indicators that will give you information. I know as an attorney looking at redacted information for 2 decades, there's a lot of information you can pick up. And what bothers me about this, it seems that we're kind of moving into this area of phishing depositions. So if you're looking for information on an institution that you can use against it vis-a-vis a student complaint, getting more actual complaints is probably helpful. I don't know if that's the motivation here, but the reality of it is that it seems you're twisting a very, very strict process that's been basically implemented throughout the entire state of California and looking for the Bureau to carve out an exemption on the way you handle complaints. And I frankly don't see that as being positive, productive, or necessary. So I would just, from an institutional standpoint, tell you that I think some of this is very overreaching.
Thank you, Mr. Johnson. Any other public comment? All right. Thank you, everyone, for your input. So, now, getting back to our agenda, we've now completed 5, we've completed 7, so we need to do 6. Status updates relating to regulations, and we don't have Kent anymore, so.
Yes, unfortunately, Kent has moved on, and that position is vacant if you know anybody. Just a real quick update on the regulations. So agenda item A, English language program submitted to OAL for notice on October 18th, 2019 in 45-day comment period, hearing December 3rd, 2019. Agenda item B, verification for exemption, has been provided to agency and suggested some comments which are under review at this point. Agenda item C, compliance with laws and policies. This has been submitted to the department for approval. However, they were making some minor additions, so it is in temporary hold right now. And agenda item D, student records. The noticing package is still being developed. Once the package is created, it will be submitted for review and edited by council, then to the department and agency for approval before going to OAL to be noticed. That concludes my report.
Thanks. I just have a quick question on B and C. If you have timelines for how long those have been at where they currently are?
That's a great question. Kent normally provides that sheet in our packet, and I don't have it at this time.
Okay, yeah, if it's possible to follow up, I'd appreciate that information.
No problem.
Do you have the D, student records and maintenance? What was the recommendation in general?
That's a great question. I can't quote it right off the top of my head right now. This is where Kent comes in.
We did review that package
Yeah, you guys
a couple
reviewed all of
meetings
them.
ago and made some suggestions and amendments to it. So we did as a bureau, as a
This
committee,
is
we did
when a
review
school
it.
closes,
Right.
somebody's going to keep the transcript.
Correct.
All right. Any public comment on our status update? Excellent. Okay. So the next item is item number 8, which is a discussion of AB 1313. And I requested this be added to the agenda because there was some confusion, I think, from schools about how this was going to work. So I asked that we put this on the agenda for some discussion. I'm not actually sure if the intent was for the Bureau staff to provide their input or it was just sort of an open conversation. I'm not sure what the thinking was on this one.
Well, we thought it might be helpful to inform the members that that we've taken a look at it. There's a provision in 1313 that adds a section to the civil code, essentially saying that this school may not refuse a transcript on the grounds that the student owns a debt, or condition the provision of a transcript on the payment of a debt, or charge a higher fee for it because of the debt, et cetera. So the Bureau's section on minimum operating standards, 94885, specifically says that the Bureau shall adopt by regulation minimum operating standards, including, I know it's in here, that the institution is maintained and operated in compliance with this chapter and all other applicable provisions. So actually going back to the regulation that we were just looking at, 6C on compliance with laws and regulations, it specifically says that the Bureau shall comply shall be maintained and operate in compliance with this act, this division, and all other applicable laws and ordinances, including but not limited to the California Ed Code and the BMP Code. And we thought we would add in the Civil Code, and that would, even though it says included but not limited to, since we're in the beginning of the process for noticing that particular reg, we would add in the Civil Code to make it clear, and then the Bureau would have the ability to bring in action for violation of minimum operating standards if that if there was a complaint that the school engaged in the conduct that's prohibited under the new Civil Code section.
So I don't think the question from the schools that I've spoken to is whether or not it applies to them. I think they assume it does. So maybe the best thing to do is, because it's not on the agenda for like a debate about what it means, I can just lay out what the questions are, and then maybe at the next meeting we could talk about what the Bureau's interpretation of those things are, because the way that this is drafted is very confusing. You're amending the Civil Code, but then there's these specific amendments to the Education Code that are specifically applicable to public schools. And it's unclear, for example, in the section that talks about the regulations shall specify the services to be withheld from the student and may include but are not limited to the provision of grades, the provision of diplomas. And so they're basically saying that the community colleges, the state schools are required to amend their regulations to say you cannot withhold transcripts, but you can withhold these other services. But it doesn't explain how that applies to non-public schools. So there's just some confusion about, is the expectation that the private schools governed by the Bureau should assume that those same things apply to them, that they're allowed to withhold services and diplomas, but they're not allowed to withhold transcripts? It's just a little confusing. The other question that's come up a bunch is this supposed to apply to every school everywhere? Is it just California institutions? Or if you're out of state, is it California residents? There's just a lot of open questions schools aren't clear on. What's a transcript? Does that have to be an official transcript from the school that it reflects all the grades they've earned? Is it an hours listing that a student might need to get a license? So, how is a transcript defined? There's just a lot of, schools want to do the right thing. They want to make sure they're prepared for this, but they're actually they're reading it and they're asking me, what does this mean? Mm-hmm. Is it just literally an official transcript is the only thing that you're not allowed to withhold? Or is it broader than that? It's just not very clear.
I think those are some good questions. I think that from the point of view of the Bureau can provide some ideas like we've done on how it will or will not enforce certain provisions of the law, or can or cannot enforce certain provisions of the law. I believe it would stop short, though, of engaging in any legal advice to the institutions that it regulates. So I think that we'd have to see what side of the fence those questions fall on. Does this apply to me? And we look at it and we say, yes, this clearly applies to you because it says private post-secondary schools. Versus, gosh, I'm trying to think of some other example to give, which is escaping me right now, but I think the Bureau is going to stop short, it's going to have to stop short of providing individual legal advice to what the schools may or may not do.
Yeah, I think what Ms. Marks is indicating is this is not in our code. We don't enforce the sections you're talking about. That's the regions, community college
Right.
district.
No,
So
yeah.
the Bureau really couldn't give an opinion about how those different entities are going to implement the law. They're the ones charged with the responsibility of developing regulations to implement these provisions.
Right, I
So
completely understand that.
We couldn't really give an opinion on that because it's not our area of law that we implement. The section that she was talking about that the Bureau would be implementing would be pursuant to that new reg that Dr. Marion just mentioned, 71755, that's currently pending, would bring in other laws that are applicable to private post-secondary institutions.
Right.
But we haven't adopted it yet.
Right.
So this is not going to be implemented by the Bureau right now, is what we're trying to say.
So okay, that's helpful. So the implementation date under the statute itself is January 2020. So for
Right.
purposes of the Bureau, that is probably not going to be, you'd need to amend the regulation and then also draft regulations that would implement this, right? Or would it just be?
I'm not seeing that it needs to be drafted. The civil code is pretty straightforward. The other sections of the ed code you're mentioning apply to the regents and the community college district and the UCs. They're the ones that are charged specifically with developing regulations to implement those provisions of law. So I would look to those bodies to see how they're planning on implementing it. Those are the agencies that are charged with implementing it.
So I understand that. I guess my question is that there's language in here that specifically tells the state schools, here's what you need to do. And it doesn't do that for the private post-secondary. So should we look to that section as guidance as what would be expected of the private post-secondaries? Or if there's no regulations, is it just going to be the civil code says X and we're just going to apply it and figure it out without any additional guidance to the school?
Well, I don't know what the Bureau plans to do with the regs, but right now it just incorporates the laws that are applicable. It doesn't go farther than that. 71755. If you want to look at the draft, I think it's been circulated to the committee, but I don't know
believe
if it's
so.
posted yet.
We did look at that.
Yeah, so it may be still online. I'm not sure if the agenda materials would still be available for that item, but essentially, the laws that you're talking about, those sections don't apply to the Bureau, so we wouldn't be going into those areas to explain our implementation because they don't apply to the Bureau.
Right, yes, I agree. I completely understand that. I think the problem is that if we're just going to add a reference to the section we're discussing that says the civil code is covered, period. So that means that this is now applicable to the schools. It doesn't answer any of the school's questions about how it applies. So if the Bureau does not intend to have regulations that are specific to, you may not withhold transcripts for debts, then the schools are still going to be in the same position of not knowing exactly what a transcript is and what does this mean. So that I guess is the question is, will the Bureau consider regulations specific to this section? And if not, that's fine. But just there's going to be schools who are not going, that will ask a lot of questions about what exactly am I allowed to withhold then?
I guess I've never had that question come up in my over 20 years working with the state about whether someone knew what a transcript was. I mean, has the Bureau staff encountered a problem with the schools not knowing what a transcript is?
I've had 5 questions about it since this came out.
Never had that.
And so I think the reason is because we have schools that have to issue certain documents, say to the Board of Nursing. You have to have what do they call it, a TAA, you're allowed to test. And that is a documentation that shows that the student has completed their program. It's not necessarily a transcript, but if the mission behind this law is, we don't want you to be withholding transcripts because it limits a student's employability, would you also assume then that telling a student, I'm not going to release your permission to test because you owe us a bunch of money, is that going to be considered a transcript? Or is transcript strictly mean an official transcript with all of your grades on it? That's literally what it comes down to.
I mean, it says transcript. And so, with the rules that deal with statutes, a transcript is a transcript, unless otherwise defined. And the statute doesn't define it differently than it's ordinarily understood to mean.
Okay.
So if it's not ordinarily understood, if it's ordinarily understood to mean something else, the legislature would have put something in here. But it just says, refuse to provide a transcript. So the assumption is that the schools know what a transcript is. So I don't know, Ms. Marks, do you disagree with, it's pretty straightforward.
No, I agree, and I'm looking for the Bureau's regulations that references transcripts, because
I thought we had a definition for it.
I'm finding,
Yeah.
like, maintenance of records in 71930 specifically says permanently retaining a transcript, and I'm not sure.
We've never had a
it's been
problem with the schools
defined
and
because they don't-
understanding what that means, in my experience with the Bureau. But if the staff can attest to there being difficulties with implementation, I haven't seen that.
I think the difference honestly comes down to if you're telling a school you must maintain a transcript for a student indefinitely, that's a pretty understandable thing. It's your final list of grades. But there are a lot of other things that schools maintain for students that might have the same impact, I guess. That could be.
So,
There's
Ms.
new
Rafferty.
things, right? I
Sorry.
mean, it's new because we're not allowed to, or schools, they're defining what a school can and cannot withhold.
Right.
Right.
So it used
So-
to be, well, I
Go
guess they could withhold anything they wanted if the student owed them money.
Other than a transcript.
So, Ms. Rafferty just refreshed my recollection. I thought it had been defined somewhere in the regs, and it has been 71-920. A transcript, in addition to the requirements of 94900B of the code, this is 71920B5. In addition to the requirements of section 94900B of the code, a transcript showing all of the following: the courses or other educational programs that were completed or were attempted but not completed, dates of completion or withdrawal, credit awarded for prior experiential learning, including the course title, credit for courses earned at other institutions, and it goes on for a bit. So, I mean, like I said, there is some definition of what a transcript is in our law. I don't have any historical knowledge about the bureaus having difficulty with the schools understanding what a transcript is. And so it's up to the bureau if they want to further venture into defining it for this purpose, but I can't imagine they would want to, because it's something that they've administered for years under that prior regulation.
Okay, that is extremely helpful, and it gives me at least the opportunity to tell schools that a transcript is as defined in the regulation, and so other things that you might be thinking, oh, does this impact this, that, or the other thing? Unless it's a transcript, it is not covered. That is the expectation.
Isn't that just for purposes of the Bureau taking action under the Administrative Procedures Act? I mean, obviously, if it's in the civil code, that doesn't preclude anyone from taking other civil action if there's a violation determined that is outside of the Bureau's ability to take administrative civil action,
Correct.
right?
District attorney at AG.
Sure. I mean,
anyone.
Right. It may clarify it for an entity operating within the framework of the Bureau's rules and regulations and potential enforcement by the Bureau, but I don't think that, I mean, obviously anyone can read whenever they want, but I don't think that it precludes, like, if a transcript doesn't meet the requirements that the Bureau has defined a transcript for, but someone determines that it's a transcript. So, like, within the letter of the law, if you're trying to comply with the Bureau for purposes of compliance there, but if you're doing something else that is not compliant with the Bureau's definition of transcript and you're withholding what is understood to be a transcript, it seems like you would still potentially be able to have, there would be action able to be taken against you if you were withholding that. It just wouldn't be administrative action by the Bureau, right?
Sure, we clarified that we can't comment about how other people would interpret the law, only how the Bureau would implement it.
Right.
And so we were approaching it from that perspective, and why we feel like those other provisions, we just couldn't go into that.
No, I
detail.
totally understand it. Thank you. I appreciate that. And Sarah, that's another great point, and one of the reasons why actually one of my clients was like, I read through where this applies and it sounds like we could be sued or go to jail for this. We really need to understand what this means. So it's all the more reason why clients want to make sure, not only from the Bureau's perspective, but just in general, that they're doing this the right way, which is why I wanted to make sure that we at least discussed it a little bit. So anyone who is watching the webcast, all two of you, can know that we had some open discussion about the applicability of this. And I don't think anyone was questioning that this would apply. It was more how, and how do we make sure we're compliant. So Thank you, this was very helpful. I appreciate it.
I have a question. Noreen, could you say again, the provision about what the Bureau can enforce, is in what regulation?
It was in one of the ones.
It will be, I'm sorry.
I think it.
Well, there is, I'm not sure what your question is exactly, if you're talking about the proposed regulation that we were just discussing, is that
Yes.
the one? It is going to be 71755, that's what's been proposed.
And in the current law, is there anything that talks about the Bureau being able to enforce this section and any other laws, et cetera, that apply, or there's nothing like that?
Well, no, as we said, the section on minimum operating standards says the Bureau shall adopt by regulation minimum operating standards, including ensuring that the institution is maintained and operating in compliance with this chapter and all other applicable ordinances and laws. So by regulation, that's what we're going to be doing in 71755, saying we can enforce as violations of minimum operating standards, violations of other provisions in the Ed Code, B&P Code, and now the Civil Code.
And what was the transcript definition section again?
Mm-hmm.
It's 71920,
B5.
B5 says, in addition to the requirements of 94900 sub B of the code, and 94900 sub B of the code. I just have it.
Yeah, it's
It talks about the required student records. So it says, in addition to those requirements, a transcript showing all of the following courses and other ed programs and et cetera, credit awarded, courses earned, credit for courses earned at other institutions, and some of those other things that Ms. Shields just enumerated. So that's in 71920, student records, the regulation, the Bureau's regulation on student records. It also talks about transcripts in 71930 on the maintenance of those records.
I think Kate raises an interesting point in that I think we want to make sure that it's not possible to interpret the requirement when there's a requirement for a certain number of hours, for example, for cosmetology or things like that, that's not somehow interpreted as not a transcript, so that a school could withhold that information from a student who needs that to take a licensing exam. So the Bureau may want to take a look at whether we do need any additional language to make that clear, that's would
So I'm
be
making the
considered-
opposite point, but yes, I think we're on the same page, that it
Point-
is.
I thought your point was you wanted it clear.
Well, I think
I'm just
I do want it to
happy-
be clear for the opposite reason, but yes, I think we're on the same page, that we just want to be clear that what a transcript is, that's all. Yeah.
94900B says, an institution shall maintain for each student granted a degree or certificate by that institution permanent records of all of the following: the degree or certificate granted and the date on which it was granted, courses and units on which the certificate or degree was based, and the grades earned in each of those courses. And then 71920, as we said, includes additional information that's going to be required, that is required for a transcript.
1788-91, Section B does articulate that the purpose of the title is to prohibit schools from interfering with employment, interfering with student educational and career opportunity by the withholding of transcripts. So it qualifies it's by the withholding of transcripts, but the implication, the purpose certainly is
Right.
barriers to employment.
Exactly why I had this question.
Yeah.
Yes. All right, so we'll see what happens with this one. But thank you, everyone, for indulging me.
Sorry.
I know that we just lost one of our members. Richie, we still good on quorum? Okay. Well, that's good, because we're almost done. Any public comment on AB 1313?
Two points. One, I believe that the council said that basically the Bureau does not enforce other regulations from other agencies. Comment there, I wasn't quite clear what your point was. You were saying that
I don't
because it's in
recall-
the Ed Code, you have no
just saying they
authority
don't
to.
That you just don't enforce those provisions of the education code related to the mandate on the regents and community colleges?
Yeah, I mentioned that she was talking about parts of the bill that don't
Mm-hmm.
apply to the Bureau. We don't implement those provisions. Those have to do with the regions and the UC.
So there
schools.
are student aid commission provisions that basically you do enforce with schools. So what's the differing part of that? Is that why this would not apply, but the CSAC regulations do?
I think it depends probably on where the statute gives direction to the agency and what schools are captured. So this provision in the new law that will take effect when AB 1313 takes effect, those sections don't list anything about a private post-secondary school. But there's other provisions under the Student Aid Commission as administered by the Student Aid Commission that reference a different swath of schools that would include private post-secondary schools, which would come under the Bureau's purview unless they're exempt, probably.
That's my understanding as well.
The determination is on the statutory direction for what applies to what cadre of schools.
And Ms. Marks maybe can weigh in on this, but if you look at the provisions of the code that deal with discipline and citation, the citation or discipline has to be based on a violation of the Bureau's laws and regulations. So you get to other laws through a law or regulation that's in the act. So you have to point to that law that allows you to incorporate by reference those other laws that are applicable to post-secondary schools. And so what we were saying is in this instance, we could not find a regulation or a statute that's currently been adopted that incorporates this new civil code provision. So what we were proposing is to add a civil code reference to the pending regulation 71755 so that the Bureau can enforce this new civil code requirement.
Yeah, and I'm not entirely clear on your question, Mr. Johnson, and what other provisions you're referencing.
Right. I mean, from a practical standpoint, one of my concern is basically if you drop in ed code provisions affecting the sector without basically referencing them in the statutes and the regulations that govern the sector, you're going to get non-compliance because of omission of not knowing. So the overall policy grasp would be that if you can put enough information in the regulations dealing with the private post-secondary sector, without them having to independently know that there's an ed code section dealing with community colleges, UC, and around transcripts, but it would basically help your compliance, it would help our compliance to have it all in one area. So while I understand theoretically that if it's an ed code section that deals with UC, CSU, community colleges, not independents, and it does kind of give the attorney generals and DAs the right to essentially, take an action against somebody for not providing a transcript on demand, it's not helpful for the overall regulatory effort from the Bureau to the regulated sector. And that's actually could apply to a number of other agencies that do touch the Bureau in terms of what the Bureau enforces. So if the Bureau is going to go out and get a complaint on, for example, I didn't get my transcript, right? Somebody withheld my transcript. So I'm going to file that complaint with your complaint agent. I'm not going to any other agency other than the Bureau, correct? I wouldn't file that with community college, UC, CSU. I will be filing that with the Bureau for Private Post-Secondary, right?
If that's the route the student wishes to take.
Right. Okay. Which is probably 99 out of 100 times generated by the student wanting the transcript, by the school saying no, student getting upset, pick up the phone, call the Bureau, goes on the tab, right? So there is that possibility you could just play gotcha, but the reality of it is that a regulatory package that just references the ed code sections that apply to these areas would be something that is reasonable and kind of makes sense and would allow for the effective implementation of this legislation rather than basically kind of play whack-a-mole with various parts of the ed code. I mean, we've run into this over the years where various sections of the ed code could apply to the sector, could not apply to the sector. Somebody takes action, everybody scratches their head, they're trying to figure out, does it apply or not apply? And, you know, if you'd like to avoid that, why not just put a regulatory package in place that basically said, this is what a transcript is, here's our regulation, Ed Code section basically applies to this, so don't withhold your transcripts. You know, that would be clean and simple, hopefully.
We do think that there are regulations already in place that discuss what a transcript contains, and that is a transcript.
I agree with that.
So I'm not sure, are you suggesting
It's the
that?
withholding part that basically needs to be broadcast and put out there, because institutions, both public, nonprofit, and for-profit, do withhold transcripts based on lack of payment and lack of services from students. It's the only effective hook they have to get the student to comply, and that's done all out California. So there will be an issue with this in terms of both public and private and nonprofits. So what I'm suggesting inside the BPPE, because we are an intentionally regulated sector, that you put that into your overall package, even if you don't intend to enforce it, but I think you do. I think you're basically telling us that if somebody is found withholding transcripts from a student, that's a violation, right? That would subject you to fine. It would subject you to a sanction by the Bureau. So you have now put the private for-profit institutions under the umbrella of basically noncompliance.
So are you suggesting that the proposed regulation enumerate specific either civil code sections or ed code sections specifically? Is that instead of generally referencing? Is that? And I don't want to get too far afield here,
well,
because
I would
this
at least
item
from
isn't
that.
on the agenda. Just want to stick with 1313.
Yeah,
but I just want to be
just for
clear.
that, yeah, absolutely. The more specific you can get in terms of allowing, and remember, we're talking about institutions that go from very sophisticated, that have people like Kate on call, and that can give them, you know, learned advice right off the bat, to mom and pop one program schools that literally don't ever read the regulations. So you're really talking about a non-sophisticated group as well as a very sophisticated group. And one thing I've found over the years is if you can put it all in one place, the chances of doing training on it are higher, the chances of basically discussions on it around peer group meetings, whether it's a conference or a seminar, are higher. If you leave it dangling in the ed code someplace off on the side, nobody's going to think about it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Greg Gallagher with the Fashion Institute of Design and Merchandising. Just to, not to add to the confusion of the discussion, but just to give some specific examples where a school that's struggling how to comply with AB 1313. And, questions immediately come up like, what's the nature of a debt? We have considerable library materials of substantial value that students at the times walk off with, and that's an obligation. I've asked for clarity from the author's office, from the AG's office, and so on, have not had it. But probably more important is the line in the under D, the notwithstanding provisions. It says use transcript issuance as a tool for debt collection. Now, debt collection starts with contact, and what, and how do you obtain contact? Well, the student either contacts you or you contact the student. And here we're talking, just to be clear about it, we're talking about debts owed, made by the institution to the student, not involving third parties, not involving a lender, not involving a servicer, whatever. So the question becomes that what we want to know is, if a student wants a transcript, is it legitimate to ask them, for contact information? Or is that a violation of the admonition of using transcript issuance as a tool for debt collection and a violation of the law? So, I think those are just two fairly obvious examples where clarity is really needed. I admit that some of them may be specific to our institution, but as a school that is trying its best to be compliant with the law as we read it, I mean, it's very confusing.
I know debt is defined in the new statute.
As obligation, and is an obligation, is debt there, is it, does that mean library materials that are in our case, are very valuable, and when a student walks off with them, that is not only an obligation owed to the school because they're owned by the school, but it precludes other students from having access to those materials. And I'm sure that you could find many other instances of different schools and different programs that are in that situation too. The point being that I think that it really, would need some clarity and some direction here if you want schools to be able to comply reasonably.
I have a question. If a student has library materials and hasn't returned them, do you then charge the student for that material?
No, we don't. There's no additional charge for that, but...
Then I don't understand the issue. If you're not going to try to collect...
Well, if they want, we do use it, have said you need to return these in order for us to release a transcript.
I see.
Yeah.
Thank you, that's helpful. A little additional context as to why everyone has questions about this. You want to update? Just one. Okay. Just one quick additional note on item 6 from Senor Marion.
Yep, David, just a quick question. Agenda item D, student records. This is an update on student record requirements, including transcripts. This proposal provides an update to original regulations, new guidance, and standards for electronic record keeping and maintenance, matching transcript requirements to the industry's norms, and providing a specific list of copies of records to be provided to the Bureau when an institution closed.
In response to David's earlier question, I believe. All right. So I think that concludes public comment on item number 8. Thank you, everyone, for your input. So this leads us to future agenda items, and one of the items that we need to discuss is the dates for future meetings. And I'm sorry to be the buzzkill on this, but I have conflicts, so it probably makes sense for us to just go through those dates and discuss them. The first meeting is scheduled for February 12th. I have a conflict on February 12th. I'm not sure how everybody else looks on that date, but I have another board meeting in another part of the state that day. Sorry, let me get my calendar open here. Richie, are you the master of the calendar? All right, so... Yeah, he emailed them this morning. I just wrote them down so we could just discuss them. So the suggested date was February 12th, which I cannot do. I could do the 19th. Is that, Richie, is that available?
I would suggest perhaps Mr. Barnard could send out a
Additional?
survey and get information from the members to see what their availability
That
is.
works
and
fine
then
for me.
Reach back out to you.
That would be great.
get those
Yeah, I just
dates
figured
set.
we would talk about the next meeting, but that still works, that's fine. And the other thing I just wanted to point out was the date that was listed for November looks like it's actually the day before Thanksgiving, the Wednesday before Thanksgiving, which I do not think you're going to have very good attendance on that date. So just a heads up on that one. So I'm totally fine as long as everyone else is with doing a note from Richie with some date options, if everyone's good. Okay. All right, well then, you don't have to listen to me talk about dates anymore. Lucky you. Any other, from the panel, future agenda items that we would like to add for Richie to?
Yes, I have a few. One is I'd like an update on the IT project. We usually have that. We didn't have that this time. I think it would be helpful if we had a little bit of info from the Bureau about how it plans to deal with the other bills that were passed this year that affect Bureau operations. I think there's at least 3 that I'm aware of.
There are 3.
I think it already made it clear that I'd like to get some more of the unsubstantiated complaints to review. And this is not really an agenda item, but if we could have, sometime well in advance of the first meeting, as soon as it's available, an updated copy of the statute and the regulations, so that it includes all the changes from this year's law and any regulations that have gone into effect since the last version. I think we haven't had a current version for the committee for a year or so that had all the updated provisions. You know how they usually provide us the whole set of the
Yeah, I think it was
statute?
January 2019, right?
Yeah, so if we could have something that would be current as of January 2020. Let's see. It seems to me that it would be worth having on the agenda some consideration of whether or not it would be useful for the Bureau to have some regulation dealing with AB 1313, or whether we think what we have is adequate. It seems to me that it might be useful, as I think Robert was suggesting. And I put an asterisk here because it's always delightful when he and I agree on something, that it might be helpful. And I think the Bureau is not precluded from setting up regulations, if it would be helpful, to make sure that that is included in the Bureau regulations so it's easier for people to find and so forth. And we could maybe address any of the ambiguities that people are concerned about. So maybe discuss that. I think I have a couple more here, but I can't understand what they mean, so I'll leave it for the next person.
You'll have an opportunity when Richie sends out the additional agenda items option.
I would like, based on Dr. Marion's earlier comment regarding allocating resources to affect the good work that we've seen, and it's been some time since we've seen an org chart with allocations of FTE by department, for example. I found that useful in the past. It would be good to see what the current structure is, including open positions. And I remember some years ago we saw, because there were so many vacancies, it was clearly articulated how many positions you were approved for and where vacancies were.
And that is now reminding me of what one of these notes means. I have been for a long time supporting the idea that we get more staff, because it seems like we're always, as you've been doing, sort of moving people to address this and that crisis. So maybe some discussion of what, if anything, we can do to help see that that happens. And then there was some discussion of the priority system for addressing complaints and so forth. And there's a statute and there's a regulation, and altogether there must be 10 to 15 different priorities listed. And someone who's giving the report mentioned that you have an algorithm to figure out how to apply all that. You may not want to disclose that algorithm. I assume that may be confidential, but if you could give some sense of how you figure out how to prioritize among the priorities, it would be helpful, I think, for us to understand.
I second Joseph's request, actually, is what I was going to say as well, if we can see an org chart. And with that, I was going to say kudos to the staff and to you, Chief, for just the level of efficiency that we've seen with even some vacancies. So congratulations on that.
I would second that, even though that's not a motion. Despite the, the questions and the things I'd like more information about, I've been impressed with the improvements that we've seen.
You second that emotion. Any other suggestions for future agenda items? Well, I would like to congratulate all of us for getting this done before 1 p.m. Go us. So we'll find out from Richie some dates for February. Hope everyone has a wonderful holiday. Chrissy, I want to say thank you to you for being our keeping us on the straight and narrow, making sure no one veers off of the Brown Act and does anything untoward that would be a misdemeanor. For those who don't know, this is Christy's last meeting as well, so thank you for all of your help. Noreen, thanks for making a cameo today. We appreciate that as well.
I'm sorry, one more thing.
Oh, yeah.
One more thing, and again, it's not for discussion so much as, I think with some new members, it would be helpful if legal staff could again send out the information about the Brown Act and any other of those kind of things.
Open Meeting Act?
The Open Meeting Act, yeah. And any of those other kind of things about really.
Always good to get a reminder.
Right, conflicts, any of that kind of stuff that we need to be aware of.
Well, our office used to do an annual update of Open Meetings Act, but I don't think it's up to date. I don't think it's been done for a while, so I'm not quite sure what we've got other than the text.
I think they're working on an update to the manual, but the guide is something we should still hand out to the members.
I would love to see that because I feel like I'm swimming in unknown waters.
Oh, that reminds me of another, I'm sorry, we're supposed to be done. But this is a question that Christy, you might have an answer to, or Doug might. I got an email, I think actually from Richie, at some point in the last few months about doing sexual harassment training. Is that something we as committee members are required to do? If we're doing it already for our job, is that sufficient if we provide a certificate, or do we have to do the state version?
Yeah.
You'll follow up, okay. Thank you. And you need it more than anyone. Sorry, little Margaret jokes over here. Okay, anybody else for the good of the order before we adjourn? No? Excellent. Happy holidays, everybody. See you in February.